The views and opinions expressed by tonight's guest and topic of discussion do not necessarily represent the official policy or position of Spaced Out Radio, Spaced Out Weekend, Spaced Out Radio Limited, its hosts, syndicated carriers, or anyone associated with this broadcast. Any rebroadcast, reproduction, or other use of this broadcast or podcast without the express written consent of Spaced Out Radio or Spaced Out Radio Limited is strictly prohibited. Listener discretion is advised.
Bumblefoot. Bumblefoot.
Are you experienced?
Stop right there!
From high atop the mountains of British Columbia to you, listening around the world, this is Spaced Out Radio with host Dave Scott.
They let us play with all our toys. They let us think that we're big boys. They let us make the louder noise, but we ain't rule the world. They let us think we're Superman.
You can follow us on our website, spacedoutradio.com, on iTunes and TuneIn. Follow Dave on Twitter at Spaced Out Radio, on Facebook at Spaced Out Radio Show, or on our YouTube channel, Spaced Out Radio Show.
I try to act so cool, but you know I'm just a fool for you. I will stop till I reach the top just to be there with you.
Dave, oh Dave, are you playing with Bigfoot and aliens again?
Dad, you gotta stop haunting the ghost. It's scaring them.
All right, seriously, put down the pointy sticks.
Oh, the deeper I fall.
Okay! Game on! Game on!
The password is...
All right.
Buckle up, space travelers. It's time to go for a ride on Spaced Out Radio. Mr. Bumblefoot, Dave is ready for liftoff.
I try to act so cool, but you know I'm just a fool for you.
Seriously, Dave? Really? Aren't you a little old for a tinfoil hat?
Hello, Toby. Bye-bye. Nephew. Bye-bye.
Please take your seat above us. We're with you. It's perfect to pick it up. Start. 2, 1. Boost ignition and lift off.
I'm such a lucky guy, 'cause after all this time, it's like the deeper I go, the deeper I fall. The deeper I go, the deeper I fall.
Good evening and welcome to Spaced Out Radio tonight. I am your host, Dave Scott, and it's good to have you along for the ride on this Wednesday, May 31st. Thursday, June 1st. If you're on the East Coast or across the pond, hope you've had a great day and night. We are live right here in the Great White North in the heart of central British Columbia as we are here 7 days a week. We welcome in our terrestrial radio stations, WQEE 99 Rock the Key down in Noonan, Georgia, home of The Walking Dead. We are live as well on the United Public Radio Network on 107.7 FM in New Orleans and over 160 countries around the world. We're live on spacedoutradio.com, Spreaker, KTLK, The Fringe FM, Renegade Talk Radio, the High Plains Talk Radio Network, and on Revolution Radio. So remember, if you're listening to the Double R Machine, it is a donation station financed by you, the valued listener. Head on over to freedomslips.com and donate today. All of our music is provided by the guitar god himself, Mr. Ron Bumblefoot THAL, formerly of Guns N' Roses, currently of Art of Anarchy. Bumblefoot is the official music of SOR. If you're on social media, you can follow us on Twitter at Spaced Out Radio. Give our Facebook page a like, Spaced Out Radio Show. On Instagram, follow me at Dave Scott SOR. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, Spaced Out Radio Show. Tune us in on TuneIn. Download this show and others from iTunes. We're also on RadioGuide.fm, TalkStream Live, Player.fm, and Stitcher. Our website is SpacedOutRadio.com. And if you want to check us out, go to Patreon.com. For as low as $1 a month, you can become a patron of SOR. Now, if you want to take part in this show, because we love audience participation around here, but we don't take phone calls. So what you got to do is you got to sign into one of the chat rooms to connect with us, either on our website by clicking Listen Live and entering the chat room there, on Revolution Radio, on Spreaker, on the UPRN chat room, or if you're on Facebook and a valued member of the SOR Space Travelers Club. Or if you're on Twitter, you can do me the favor, use the hashtag SpacedOutRadio. I will get to your questions and comments in there as well. If you head to our website for $5 a month, you can become an SOR Space Traveler. And we also have the brand new Spaced Out Radio store. T-shirts, posters, stickers, soon to be Carl the Candle. Yes, Carl the Alien. He's coming out of retirement, but in candle form. He's there. We also have a news section called The Encounter Online, dealing with all the cool news of the day, courtesy of our editors Eric Markham and Everett Themer. You can check out my latest blog there as well, and if you've had an experience you can't explain, fill out an SOR Sightlines report. I'm joined by the preacher Eric Markham tonight as he'll be co-hosting with me as we go into the dark side. Spy, famed, occultist, or just misunderstood individual. Tonight we talk about the man otherwise known as Secret Agent 666. Edward Aleister Crowley was an English occultist, ceremonial magician, poet, painter, novelist, and mountaineer. He founded the religion Thelema, identifying himself as the prophet entrusted with guiding humanity into the 20th century. His following is widespread, from Ozzy Osbourne's famed hit Mr. Crowley. Jimmy Page even owned his house, and his wide hypnotic eyes peer at us on the cover of the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. So, how did this man, born into riches, become the father of modern occult, where his influence still attracts millions of followers to what people call the dark side? Author Richard Spence argues that Crowley was actually a very patriotic Englishman who endured years of public vilification in part to mask his role as a secret agent. The verification of the great beast's participation in the 20th century's most astounding government plots will likely blow the minds of all Spaced Out Radio listeners tonight. Richard Spence, welcome to Spaced Out Radio tonight. How are you?
I'm doing fine. How are you, Dave?
Excellent. Preacher, how you doing?
Doing great.
Wonderful. Richard, this is such an intriguing topic. And, I know that a lot of people out there have mysticism and a lot of thoughts, and some even love the whole occult persona. What made you chase down what Aleister Crowley was all about?
Well, let me start with, I guess, a kind of basic disclaimer so that the audience knows where it is I'm coming from. I'm not a Crowleyite, if that makes any sense. I'm not a follower. I don't belong to any organizations. I'm not an occultist. I have an interest in it. I have a lot of interest in things. I have an interest in baseball, but I'm not a baseball player. So what draws me to Aleister Crowley is not really any kind of attraction to his mysticism. Again, I find that an intriguing part of him, but that's not what really drew me to him. And I think you raised an interesting thing in the introduction when you said, well, you know, is he a spy, or is he an occultist, or is he just a misunderstood individual? You know, what I would say is that it doesn't have to be any one of those three or any two of them. He can be all three of them at the same time. And that's one of the things that's true for Aleister Crowley, and it's true for you and I and everybody else out there, is that we're all a number of things. We're the person that our family knows. We're the person that our coworkers know. We're the person that our significant other knows, and those, you know, may be close, but they're not quite the same thing. And then we're the person that only we know. And I think that's one of those things that if everybody sort of looks inside them, you know that there's a certain part of you. There's an aspect of your life and your beliefs, of your being, that only you are really aware of. And it's not necessarily that type of thing is something bad or evil that you wouldn't want to share. It's just something which is uniquely you and private. So all of us are a number of people, and we appear in different guises to different people. You know, if you work in retail, you work in any kind of public sector, you know, you relate to the customers in a different way than you relate to other people. So Crowley's like that as well. He's not one person, he's many people. And what drew me to him, well, you know, I sort of came across this historical tale, I suppose the way I come across everything, probably by looking for something else. Okay. It was kind of serendipity. So back around the end of the 90s, I was deeply involved in another research project that had to do with another character who was his own sort of story, a guy named Sidney Riley, and he was a spy, an intelligence agent, and con man, and again, he was many people. And I knew that he had spent most of the First World War in New York. In fact, that's where Riley's activities were centered at the time. And Riley, not to go too far into that, was connected to people involved in British intelligence in New York. And I'd come across that, well, Aleister Crowley was in New York at the same time. Now, I had nothing else really to connect these guys together other than the fact that I remembered that Crowley had claimed at various points later that he had, despite all appearances, and we may go more into that later on, but despite appearances of being a very unpatriotic Englishman, he claimed that he actually had been doing work for His Majesty's government during that time in New York. So I thought, well, that seems to involve intelligence, and so is it possible that his and Riley's paths crossed? That's what I was interested in. What I was actually trying to do is to see whether or not Riley was connected to Crowley. So I wrote off to Washington, D.C., to the National Archives, because I knew that in the National Archives was one of the few repositories of intelligence records from that period that had been declassified. And I might just point it out as an aside, is that anytime you do research in anything involving intelligence, you run up against a very big problem or a barrier. And that barrier is that despite things like the Freedom of Information Act here or the UK or elsewhere, that never covers intelligence materials. Those are secret for a very particular reason. So it's hard to get access to the original materials. But back in 1917, 1918 in the U.S., about the time the U.S. first entered the First World War, most domestic intelligence, what we would think of as the job of the FBI today, was actually performed by a branch of the U.S. Army called the Military Intelligence Division. Now, that organization's essentially morphed and more or less disappeared during World War II, superseded by the CIA and NSA and all of the other three-letter agencies. But the old records of the MID from the First World War were declassified, and they're sitting in the National Archives. And beyond that, they've got this whole microfilmed 3x5 index card system of all the suspects and files and reports that they had. So it's a great resource for that period. So I wrote off to the National Archives, and I just was wondering whether in the MID files there was anything on Aleister Crowley. Well, got a hit. There was. And they sent me the file. It wasn't very long. In fact, the whole thing is maybe about 30 pages. So I'm looking through it, And about that time, when I was aware, I was that Crowley had made claims to have had connection to intelligence. And that's always the way they were phrased. He claimed this, and of course, he couldn't present any proof of it, and nobody seemed to take him too seriously. So I'm going through this file, and I'm looking, and there's a report from the MID resident officer in West Point, New York, up in the Hudson River Valley from 1918. And he had become intrigued by Crowley's activities and his alleged connections to German agents, and was apparently thinking about swooping in and arresting him. But he decided that maybe, since this guy's an Englishman, maybe I should check with the British consulate in New York in terms of what they know about him. And I'm going to read you from the actual document, the report. This little section is Aleister Crowley, English subject, previous correspondence none. And the key element is, it says here, let's see, Crowley, who had been formally investigated by the Department of Justice on charges of being a German spy, it was determined that Aleister Crowley was an employee of the British government at present in this country on official business of which the British consul, New York City, has full cognizance. It was found that the British government was fully aware of the fact that Crowley was connected with this German propaganda and had received money for writing anti-British articles. So that may not seem like much, but what it was a kind of smoking gun that meant that what Crowley had said later on seemed to have a good element of truth in it. Because the British consul said that he was, remember, an employee of the British government in this country on official business of which the British consul has full cognizance. So what I did, I sort of, was continuing my work on the Riley topic. I had to get that book done, but I did a short article. It was published in a journal, and that was the first thing that was titled Secret Agent 666. And I should point out here that, as any kind of spy, Aleister Crowley never had the code name Secret Agent 666, but it's a great title. So that's what I gave the title to the article, and subsequently I couldn't think of a better one for the book, and that continued there as well. So what the article basically said is that, well, Crowley's claims to have been working with the knowledge of the British government and for the British government in the United States during World War I is validated by the MID's investigation and the statements of the British consul. What the article really didn't go much further into, though, is what exactly was he doing? See, what we've established is that, yeah, okay, he is working for His Majesty's government, but then, of course, that creates a bigger picture of what was this official business that the British consul had full cognizance of. So I was involved in other things, but that article did something that most academic articles never do. One of the unfortunate things about a lot of academic research, at least academic history research, is that very often you write an article, even write a book and publish them, and it's pretty much like you dug a hole in the backyard and buried it. It tends not to reach a particularly wide audience. But, as you mentioned, Aleister Crowley has become much more famous in death than he ever was in life. And there is an entire worldwide network of people who they sort of Crowleyverse, I've sometimes called it. And that article was, thanks to the internet, spread around, and I started getting emails, letters from people, mostly thanking me for writing the article, some suggesting things, but a lot of what I was getting was that, why don't you carry this further? There's a bigger story here. Why don't you write a book on it? And initially I didn't like that idea. I had other projects I wanted to do. In fact, there was a whole project I had in mind that I've never gotten back to because it got derailed by this one, which I think was ultimately the better choice. But it was basically people encouraging me to do it and my own curiosity that said, okay, I'm not sure there is. I really wasn't sure there was a book in this. I was sort of half convinced that I would get into it and find out there wasn't much more to be found. And then I started digging. And once you start digging, all kinds of things turn up.
Do you think, Dr. Spence, do you think part of the persona of the beast was more, in Crowley's respect, was that more him rebelling against sort of strict parents in the beginning?
Well, I think, as you mentioned in the introduction, he was born into a, not filthy rich family. He was born into an affluent family. He was born into not the British aristocracy, but the British upper middle class. The Crowleys made their money. The family made its money in brewing. His father then also branched out into what today we would call real estate speculation. But they were well off, certainly more wealthy than the rest. And other parts of the family had, and this becomes important later on, political connections. And that would do well as... But the Crowleys, his immediate family, were members of what was called the Plymouth Brethren. And the Plymouth Brethren were a very, everybody can sort of imagine Massachusetts Bay Colony Puritans. Pretty much the same ideology. The Plymouth Brethren might have thought the Puritans were having way too much fun. It was a relatively small sect whose basic ideology could probably be pretty easily summed up as that they were going to heaven and everybody else was damned to hell. And there wasn't much enjoyment to be found in this world. It was all about preparing yourself for the next. Crowley's father, who had enough money from his various investments and family money really not to work, really became a lay preacher. He saw a kind of calling to the ministry. Now, here's an interesting thing to consider. Crowley, although in a very different direction, basically follows in his father's footsteps. His father was a minister of the Christian gospel, and what Aleister did was to become a minister of his own gospel. But they're both these sort of religious teachers. They both have this impulse to preach and to convert. And that is something I think he did get from his family. Now, his relationship with his father ended pretty early. His father died when I think he was around 11 or 12. That was, by all appearances, pretty devastating to the young Eddie Crowley, as he was known at the time. And something that you can always play, armchair Freudian and trying to figure out what sort of childhood traumas shaped one individual or another, but that was fairly traumatic, and that seemed to have had a lasting impact on him. It also basically left him under the care of his mother that he had a much more complicated relationship with, and his mother's brother, his uncle, who he had a complicated and rather unpleasant relationship with. So that's where things in terms of his father's death was a very important element early on in life, and that seems to have changed the circumstances and how he might have turned out differently. Who knows? Maybe he would have become a loyal follower of the Plymouth Brethren. But that religious impulse then somehow got connected with rebellion. Because much of what he does early in life, to me, looks like a kid acting out against an overbearing mother and his mother's relatives and doing everything he could to thwart and infuriate them.
But it's almost Shakespearean, like Hamlet. The mother he loves, and then the uncle comes in and tries to displace the father. And from all accounts, the uncle was as austere and miserable a human being as you could imagine.
Well, that's the picture we get of him. It would be interesting to sit down with his uncle and talk about what he thought of his nephew. I'm sure that, there are always sort of two sides to the story. But yeah, it's actually kind of Dickensian. The child left, sort of in the care of the weak mother and the overbearing uncle, and he had a lot of problems in school. He does eventually end up in Cambridge, which is, one of the two premier British universities, even more so then than now. It was either Oxford or Cambridge. And the thing to remember about those universities, particularly in this period, and we're talking about the 1880s, 1890s, when he's coming of age, is that those were the training ground for the British elite. Oxford and Cambridge was where the administrators and the rulers of the British Empire were schooled. Very few people, relatively speaking, got into it, and that's where the political connections. He did have a friend in the family, and that's an aunt, Annie, or Anne Crowley. He always seems to have been very close to her, and he's close to her up until at least the early 1920s, and she, you know, again, to play armchair Freudian, seems to have been a kind of substitute mother and the one person in the family who tended to support him in some of his activities, not necessarily the occult ones, but it's probably through her efforts to some degree that he got into Cambridge. Didn't finish it, but then most people who got in didn't.
When did he start to shift into the occult? What attracted Aleister Crowley to the dark side, if we can call it that?
Well, again, I think his early religious experience and exposure within the family had what that did, if nothing else, even if he rejects Christianity, if he rejected the Plymouth Brethren and all that it stood for, the one thing that it did was that it imparted to him the importance of the spiritual. I mean, that's one way to think of it. He grew up in a household that was religious, and in his own way, he remains religious for the rest of his life. I mean, you can look at Crowley as an occultist, but keep in mind that he's also the propagator. He sees himself the prophet of a religion. That's what he thinks that his calling is. Not to be a kind of wizard, not to be Gandalf or Sauron or anything like that, but to be the prophet of a new religious dispensation. I mean, that's going way beyond whatever it was that, you know, Daddy the Preacher might have aspired to. I think it was that. You know, there's also a kind of native curiosity, and then the one thing that he mentions, and I think this is in the 1890s, and it's actually when he was in Cambridge, I believe, and he talks about an experience that he had in Stockholm, which is kind of an interesting place. So how did he get to Stockholm? Well, he was on his way to Russia. And why he was on his way to Russia is another question, but putting the pieces together, part of his training, I mean, remember, Cambridge is a training ground for the British elite. And an interesting part of the British elite that he early on aspired to be a part of was the British diplomatic service. And early on, that's what he saw himself as doing. He was going to go into the service of the king, the queen at that point, and to serve as in a diplomatic post, which that's also the first maybe little hint of where the intelligence aspect comes in, because particularly in that period, even as today, the line between diplomat and intelligence agent or espionage and diplomacy is a rather vague one in some respects. So he's on his way to what he describes as a kind of mission, being sent abroad, and what it almost certainly was, is it was a kind of test run. He's being sent to a foreign posting, just basically to see how he would behave. Maybe it's even possible that there was an intelligence aspect of that. I mean, he's being sent to essentially observe and report. Look, we're going to send you to Russia. You're going to go to Moscow and St. Petersburg, and while you're there, you're going to keep your eyes open, and you're going to keep your ears open, and you're just going to kind of keep a diary, something that Crowley always did for the rest of his life, of who you met and where you met them, and who said what, and what rumors you heard, and what other interesting things you saw. You know, part of it was as a test to see whether or not someone could actually function in a foreign environment, someone could actually do that. Could they actually come up with some kind of reasonable report? But something happened to him on the way, and he had what sounds like to me is you could either call it a spiritual or a religious experience. But that changed him. Something happened to him at that point that changed the whole direction of his life and then drew him away from government service and instead devoting his life to this single-minded pursuit of becoming a prophet. Now, what that is, in his own cryptic way, he never really describes. I've had other people describe it, you know, a religious mystical experience. I don't know. There are probably people out there in the audience who've had them. I'm not sure I've ever been graced with anything quite like that. I've had some interesting experiences, but nothing that I could really say is a truly mystical one. But I've talked to people who have, And the one thing about them is that they are profound, but they are also indescribable. I mean, it is an experience that is so personal, that is so intense, and maybe in some ways so revelatory about the person themselves and their place in the world that you really can't communicate it to anyone else. I remember one fellow saying once, if I told you this, it wouldn't make any sense and I would just sound nuts. And I couldn't possibly convey to you what it actually meant to me in that point. But that's something which isn't unique to Aleister Crowley. It happens not to everyone, not to most people, but it happens to some, and it happened to him. And then you can get all kinds of questions. Was this actually the forces on the outside, forces on the dark side, forces on the other side, forces from somewhere else reaching out and touching him, which is what he thought it was? Or was it some sort of entirely internal experience? Crowley himself is, again, and I'm looking at this from the standpoint of someone who's not a believer, of someone who's not looking at him as a prophet. That's not the way in which I'm interested in him. But he's an extremely enigmatic and in some ways cryptic in what he's doing. Part of it is that he's deliberately being secretive in some cases. But I think in other ones, it's because he's trying to describe things that really don't lend themselves to words, something that you can't really encompass in any kind of language or any kind of narrative experience. Crowley seems to me to have believed that early on, with this experience, and perhaps others that followed that, certainly his experience in Cairo in 1904, that the other side, this sort of larger, invisible world, had reached in and had touched him. It sort of and he felt chosen by that. And again, it's something that doesn't happen to most people. And when it does, if you look through history, people show up and angels talk to them. Well, if an angel has come to you and talked to you and suddenly said that God wants you to be his prophet, well, that makes you special. That gives you a particular mission in the world. And Crowley thought that, I think that he really thought, or at least he believed, which isn't the same thing as knowing, that he had been chosen in some way, and that therefore he needed to dedicate his life to fulfilling this mission that had been given to him. I'm not sure he ever quite figured out the way to do that. But there's one point that I think it's something from his book Magic Without Tears, in which he makes a statement. I'm going to have to paraphrase it here, but he's saying, magic really comes from within us. It's not something external. Almost suggesting that there isn't anything external. Everything, the occult, the supernatural, whatever that we perceive and experience is really all something that comes out of us and out of our mind. That's where these things exist. And if we create gods and demons and give them names and attribute them these things, we're simply creating a kind of aspect of ourselves. So that to me was very different than what he seems to be saying elsewhere, that there is this sort of external occult world of spirits and gods and demons. Or is it simply something that's just an artifact of our mind? And that's one of the things that really sort of intrigued me about the guy, and it comes back to this question of who he is, what he actually believed about himself and things around him. And the question, which you might have been trying to get at in one way, is how much of what is popularly perceived about him, the arch-Satanist of the 20th century or the grand occultist of the 20th century. Here's a question I have. How much of that was an act? How much of it was a performance, a character, a kind of a persona that he created for public consumption? And how much of that was really him? And how much of what was really him was something else?
Was he a full-on Satanist, though, or was he just dabbling in the occult?
Well, it gets into this question of how you define Satanist. Are you talking about theistic Satanists? Or are you talking about sort of lifestyle Satan? Really, there are apparently different versions of it. So let's put it this way. Did he believe in the devil as an actual entity, and did he serve the interests of that entity? I can't see really that he ever did. I think that's one of those things that's part of the myth that grew up about him. And again, I say that my purpose in writing this isn't either to condemn him. I didn't have much of an opinion about him one way or the other. I mean, I knew the general story about him. And one of the things in sort of researching the research that I did was that it revealed a number of different levels to it. And I think that it was the British writer Dennis Wheatley, who was also involved in intelligence, and a friend of Aleister Crowley, who probably sometime in the 30s, he was one of those people who remained a friend of Crowley, and Crowley didn't keep many friends. He wasn't an easy person to get along with. That was pretty obvious. But I think it was Wheatley who said that there were two things that he would never do involving Aleister Crowley. One was to lend him money, and the other was to leave him alone with his children. And the latter doesn't seem to have come from the idea that he thought that Crowley was going to do some horrible thing to his children, but rather that he would frighten them in some respect. Now, he wasn't particularly good with children in that route. And those are probably both fairly smart moves on Wheatley's part. Certainly the lending him money, because if Crowley failed absolutely at one thing, it was a businessman. He seems to have been, he was pretty good at spending money, was not good at earning it or managing it, which is why he spent the latter part of his life as a bankrupt and spent another part of it sort of begging crumbs and bits and pieces from people. So he's a complicated figure, and this is where the spy aspect becomes a portion of that. And one of the questions that people might have is, well, why on earth would any intelligence agency, who are supposed to know what they're doing, why would they ever employ or use a person of such notorious immorality? And that's pretty much what it was that Crowley became known for more than anything else, more than being a Satanist. He came... this is what got him most of his bad reputation. He publicly and repeatedly thumbed his nose at the mores of existing British society at the time. He made it abundantly clear that he despised everything that sort of bourgeois, Victorian, Edwardian morality stood for, and he went out of his way to show his contempt for it. And that won him admiration in some small quarters. It also, earned him the general dislike and horror of much of what considered to be the decent public. Now, again, even if part of what he was doing was, maybe part of it was acting out against his mother, maybe that's, that's one way to look at it. He spent his entire life trying to piss off his mother even after she was dead. Or it was a persona that he developed. I mean, one of the things that he got by being this kind of occult dabbling or practicing bad boy was that he got attention. And there's the element of he aspired, as many people do, to a level of celebrity. That again is why I think he would be, he would probably be amazed at the amount of attention that his name receives today compared to what it did when he was alive. And yet, in trying to seek, it's this whole idea, do you go for fame or do you go for infamy? Because they'll both work in many respects. And what he veered off into was sort of, and maybe in the long run mistakenly, trying to develop infamy as over actual fame. Or if he couldn't achieve fame for what he really wanted to be, being a prophet, then infamy would do. And that earned him a reputation as a Satanist, which, frankly, from what I've seen, is undeserved. I don't think that he was a theistic Satanist. I don't think that he was someone who practice Satanism as a kind of ethical, non-religious concept. It was probably something he considered. I mean, again, you noticed the point, dabbling. I think he did more than dabble in the occult. What we tend to think of as the occult really sort of became a central kind of religious. I mean, to him, keep in mind, the occult is religion. Those two things are really sort of two different words for the same thing. But to him, very much, we tend to think of his occult pursuits were always to him religious pursuits. But he was trying to make contact. He was trying to get back into contact with this outside forces that had sort of reached out and touched him. And I don't know whether in the end he really cared whether it was God or the devil. I mean, if there was something out there, if there was some great external force that had chosen you, that spoke to you, that opened itself up to you, and offered this kind of larger world, at some point from this aspect, I don't think it really mattered. And what he wanted was to achieve that contact and to pursue this kind of, he's after the same thing most people are to some degree, spiritual enlightenment and satisfaction.
Well, that kind of ties into one of the more popular quotes that's, "Do as thou wilt," which many have taken as, you can do whatever you want. But that's not really what Crowley was getting at. Can you elaborate more on what you think he meant by "do as thou wilt"?
Well, I can go back. First thing I start with is that he didn't originate that term. It's like a lot of the people who become famous for saying something, if you look closely, it ends up they didn't actually say it. They're the ones who marketed it the best, and that's what Crowley did. "Do what thou wilt," basically, was originally, it comes from a Renaissance play by the French writer Rabelais, from a play called Gargantua. And that's where the term comes from, and that play was then popular during Elizabethan times and later, and then it was the motto of the 18th century Hellfire Club. I don't know how many people out there may have heard of that, but the Hellfire Club was a early 1700s, sort of before the American Revolution, again, a wealthy, well-established British Englishman by the name of Sir Francis Dashwood, formed a kind of private gentleman's club which, reenacted pagan rituals, possibly satanic rituals, play black masses, maybe real black masses, and did all kinds of generally unspeakable, dissolute things, but got away with it because they were rich and influential. But they adopted that motto. So when Crowley's bring it, first it's introduced by a French writer who puts it into the mouth of his imaginary characters. Then it's appropriated by, I think, what we could safely call an occult gentleman's secret society in 18th century England, and Crowley adopts it later on, or the same term comes up. Now, for Crowley, "do what thou wilt be the whole of the law" is the essential statement of thelema, which means will. And the thing that tends to permeate his, what some people call, either thelema or Crowleyanity, if you prefer, is the idea that you have to know your own true will, and that will, I think his other statement about what magic is, and that magic is the art, and here again I have to paraphrase it, but magic is the art and science of causing change through the application of will, sort of mind over matter. So what will is, "do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law." It's one of those things that it doesn't mean there aren't going to be any repercussions for what you do. I mean, there's a difference between saying "do what you want." I mean, how many times might you have said this to someone, I don't know, like a child or a friend or someone else, and go, "Well, do what you want. Okay, it's your choice. You go ahead and do it. I may not approve of that choice. I may actually think that your choice is a pretty stupid one and is going to come to a bad end, but you're going to do what you want, and the only way you're going to figure that out is if you do it." I don't know. It's one of those things that as a parent or as a friend, or even on the other end of it, having parents and friends tell you this, a lot of times the only way that you learn something is a bad idea is you try it out and you fail. Other people, trying to tell other people that they're wrong almost never works. and in the same way that them trying to do the same thing to you. So there's this very sort of, I don't know what is the term, there is a particular and mystical meaning to the whole concept of will in Crowley's thinking. And I'm not sure that I fully understand that. I mean, not being immersed into it, I am looking at it from the outside, but I think, to me, what much of it seems to come down to is self-realization. I guess it comes back to this, who are you really? Are you this person? And one of the things that we want is a certain degree of self-realization, and that's what I think is the key to it, for what that's worth.
In a lot of ways, it seems like he was primed, and he was primed to be the perfect double agent. I mean, he has this moral ambiguity about him. He has a sexual ambiguity about him. It's almost like you couldn't create a better person to be a double agent than Aleister Crowley.
Well, you would think, initially, it goes back to this question, why would an intelligence agency ever hire someone that notorious and immoral? And, well, it's like John Le Carre has pointed out, and the espionage writer, and a very good one, in my opinion, is that, to really operate in intelligence, at least in a kind of on a field agent level, to be put out into the field, requires, shall we say, a certain degree of moral and ethical flexibility. You can't be squeamish. You have to be willing to improvise. You have to be willing to pretend to be things that you're not. And you have to be able to play other roles convincingly. So one of the things that I'm not sure I've seen anybody else say, but it's one of those things that sort of struck me about Crowley, is that in many ways he seemed to be a pretty good actor. And that's why it sort of brings me back to this idea as to how much of what he was doing, I mean, not to suggest that his occultism or his desire for religious fulfillment, however you want to describe it, is phony. That's not what I mean. It means that to what degree is that played up in certain circumstances for effect? How much of it is being done for effect? There's a couple of other points. It comes back to, I was actually teaching a class today. We were talking about this, and the question that one person asked is that, well, where does the sort of meeting point between what we call occultism and intelligence, is there some sort of common ground there? And I thought about it, and I said, well, look, what intelligence basically is involved in the simplest form, is trying to obtain information from unwilling sources or difficult sources. You're trying to get data. You're trying to acquire knowledge. And you have to often use, well, let's say, surreptitious means to do that. And then, on the other hand, you're trying to protect the knowledge you gain and the knowledge you have from other people trying to acquire it. So, in intelligence, you're attempting to aggressively acquire information and to prevent others from aggressively acquiring your information. Now compare that with what, let's say, an occultist would do, someone working in that realm. The whole point of occult workings, whether it's alchemy, whatever it might be, or hermetic magic, is to acquire knowledge and information. That is, to acquire that, and to very often acquire it from unwilling or difficult sources. So if you have to draw a magic circle on the floor and get a grimoire and summon up demons in order to get the information you want, if you have to engage in talking to the dead through necromancy, that's an aspect of it. But it's the acquiring of knowledge and then to protect and guard that knowledge. So there, at that level, at a certain basic level, there's a kind of similar mindset. And there's also the mindset that you have to do whatever it takes to get that done. Again, you cannot be squeamish. You need people who can be flexible. You need people with moral flexibility in those situations. And as you noted, Crowley had that. He had flexibility in all. He could be what it was that the situation required. And so there's a kind of training that goes, it's both in terms of the occultism itself, and then also the other thing that's often connected to the occult and to magic is a lot of fakery. And that was something that Crowley was very much aware of, is that most of the people out there claiming to be magicians and mediums and the rest are fakes. They're charlatans. And that's, for instance, supposedly why in his spelling of magic he put a K on it to differentiate that from the MAGIC magic, which was stage magic. But he had a kind of interesting view of stage magic, that we generally expect magicians to do. Now, we know the magicians are performing tricks when we go to see a stage magician. But what actually is going on there is a mimicry of magic with a K. So the stage magician is performing tricks that look like magic, that look as if they have some kind of supernatural import. And while we consciously know that they're tricks, we're still mystified by his ability to fool us and pull it off. Of course, there's one of the things about, why tricks are handy, even for someone who, let's say, is an actual magician, someone who is actually dealing with occult forces, is that the thing about the tricks is that once you master them, they work all the time. So think of it this way. If you're going to get results by casting spells and summoning a spirit to help you, well, that gets kind of tricky because the spirit has to agree. So you've just brought another party into the whole thing, and you have to work it out. The trick doesn't think. The trick may look the same, and it gets results, and it satisfies the audience, and it creates the appearance of the outside world, and you don't have to work that hard. And Crowley, I think I try to quote this in the book somewhere, once noted is that, studying magic and those kinds of tricks is sort of great preparation for Secret Service work. I think he says, is that studying spiritualism and the like is a great preparation for Secret Service work because you learn all the tricks, which can then be useful in a practical application. One of the things in terms of stage magic or any form of magic is deception, sleight of hand, making people not see things and see other things. And that, again, is part of these techniques that could be very useful for an agent in the field.
We only have a couple of minutes before we got to go to break here, about 3.5 minutes. I do want to ask you about his sexual promiscuity, because, let's face it, he liked to get around. Men, women, orgies everywhere. He liked to party.
That he did, and usually with I mean, Crowley is kind of, you could argue he sort of missed his era. Had he shown up in the 1960s, he might have been a much bigger hit than he would have in the early part of the 20th century with the predominant Victorian values of the time. He was in many ways a kind of pioneer in free love and sort of freewheeling ambisexuality, pansexual. That's what I would call him in this case. Crowley wasn't heterosexual, homosexual, bisexual. He was pansexual. Anything that would, but again, much of it for ritual purposes. And then the other thing that he was a pioneer in was the use of recreational drugs. Although in both these cases, we talk about him using sex and drugs recreationally. Yeah, but usually in the pursuit of some spiritual or occult purpose, some ritual purpose. Those things are actually probably more commonly used by him for ritual ends. So, even when he looks like he's just being a libertine having a good time, well, maybe there was something deeper to that. On the other hand, maybe if it looks like there's something deeper to it, he's really just a libertine having a good time.
Well, everybody can have a good time. Was he using, you mentioned that he was using sexuality to try and find that enlightened time. A lot of people feel that that happens during an orgasm. Is that why he was trying to attempt this, to see if there was something spiritual and realistic about it?
Well, one of the things that he seems to have been sort of exposed to fairly early and used throughout his life is what's generally called sex magic. And that's one of those things that we may go into greater detail after the break. But sex magic basically is the idea that Very few human activities arouse greater intense emotion than the sex act. And the idea from the ritual use of that is that you focus that energy to achieve some kind of idealized ritual goal. And that goal could be anything from summoning a spirit or a god or trying to create wish fulfillment, but it's sort of channeling that whole energy to another purpose, which, if you really think about it, is not quite as much fun as you might assume, because it's making sex a job. Okay? And those two things seldom go together that well.
On that note, we are going to get ready to take our first break of the night here on Spaced Out Radio. The preacher Eric Markham joins me as co-host. We are talking with author Richard Spence, Aleister Crowley. We got 2 more hours of learning about the mysticism of Secret Agent 666, even though that wasn't really his name, but we're going to get into that during the break. Make sure you check out our website, spacedoutradio.com, where we have a lot of things going on. And do me a favor, learn about the first annual Spaced Out Radio Paracon that will be happening September 29th to October 1st of this year in 108 Mile Ranch, British Columbia, at the beautiful Spruce Hills Resort. We definitely want you to get in on that. Tickets are going to be available, VIP tickets. Early sales going to be starting in June, so make sure you check it out. You're listening to Spaced Out Radio. I am your host, Dave Scott. We'll be back right after this. Coming September 29th to October 1st, the first annual Spaced Out Radio Caribou Paracon. Hi, this is Dave Scott. The event will be held at the Spruce Hills Spa and Resort in 108 Mile Ranch, British Columbia. Come join us for an amazing weekend of speakers talking all things paranormal, UFOs, ghosts, aliens, Sasquatch, intuitiveness. Listen to great speakers like Miriam Delicato, Samantha Mowat, and the crypto guru Ronald Murphy. Get your VIP passes by going to spacedoutradio.com and clicking on the Paracon banner. Come to BC, where the paranormal is waiting for you.
From coast to coast to coast, Blacklight Uncharted is taking on the paranormal across Canada. From ghostly hauntings to the UFOs flying above in conjunction with MUFON Canada, we're closely investigating what's going on in the northern skies and checking out the apparitions that walk among us. Check out our videos right here at spacedoutradio.com. We want to know your thoughts, we want to hear your experiences, and we want you to share your stories. The answers are out there, and we intend to find them.
Would you like to become one of our space travelers? All you have to do is click on the Space Travelers icon at spacedoutradio.com. For only $5 a month, you can get access to some great prizes, as well as private monthly shows, newsletters, and a members-only section on our website. Become a space traveler today.
It's paranormal news at its finest. Welcome to The Encounter. At spacedoutradio.com, The Encounter online is SOR's trusted news source for everything weird and strange going on around the world. This is news editor Eric Markham. Our team of journalists are scouring the planet for those strange stories that rarely make the mainstream. No fear-mongering or fake news here. Head over to spacedoutradio.com and encounter The Encounter.
Hey, this is Canadian paranormal investigator Mike Moore. The third Wednesday of every month, I'll be teaming up with Dave Scott to bring you Ghosts of the Great White North. Each month, we will bring on guests from across Canada to discuss their ghostly encounters. Canada is a paranormal hotbed with stories you've never heard, so we're going to bring them to you. So get comfy on your Chesterfield, grab a donut, and join us, eh?
Have you had an experience you can't explain? Had a run-in with ghosts, maybe Bigfoot, or seen lights in the sky? Hi, I'm Mike Schmidt from the SOR Sightlines. I'm here to investigate your sighting. Head to spacedoutradio.com and fill out a report on the Sightlines. All your information is 100% confidential, and I will help you figure out what you've been seeing. File your report and let's find out the answers together.
Visit purpleplates.com today. For over 40 years, the Purple Energy Plates have been delivering amazing results for their many customers. Inspired by the great genius Nikola Tesla, the harmony, healing, and energetic effects of the plates have proven over and over to be beneficial and often miraculous to thousands of customers. With their money-back guarantee and the many benefits, how can you afford not to get one? Check their site for daily specials and choose from their many energy products. You won't be sorry. Visit them today at purpleplates.com for mind, body, and spirit, and expect a miracle.
Are you interested in advertising on Spaced Out Radio? Head to our website at spacedoutradio.com and click on our advertising tab. There, you will find an assortment of ways you can get your product out there with us, from radio commercials to banners and social media. Have a product you like our hosts to endorse? We can do that too. Visit spacedoutradio.com for more details.
Have you got your Cosmic Passport? If you need one, tune in to Cosmic Passport on Spaced Out Weekend. This is Elizabeth Anglin, ET experiencer, spirit medium, and host of Cosmic Passport. Each weekend I'll be bringing you interviews and support from other paranormal experiencers, and the best in intuitive spiritual guidance from across the globe. It's all happening starting at 9 p.m. Pacific Time, midnight Eastern, on spacedoutradio.com.
From British Columbia to Northern California, Pacific North Weird has Cascadia covered. Check out our feature videos at spacedoutradio.com, where I, Vincent Zunza, and my super sleuth partner Alexandra Sullivan track down the weird and strange stories from around the Pacific Northwest. From Bigfoot to Mel's Hole and everything in between. This is what makes life exciting. So why report the normal when we can report the Pacific North Weird right here at spacedoutradio.com.
Oh, there's only one way to rock. Loud and proud. In high definition. Radio 702 rocks. Las Vegas.
Every Saturday and Sunday night, as Dave Scott wanders aimlessly in the wilderness, you can come hang out with me, James Tyson, in Spaced Out Weekend. Starting at 9 p.m. Pacific, midnight Eastern, I'll take you along as we talk with some of the best experts in their fields. SpacedOutRadio.com is the place to find us. So sit down, relax, put your feet up, enjoy the topics like the paranormal, supernatural, intuitiveness, and so much more. Hope to see you there.
Don't have time to listen to Spaced Out Radio live? Wherever you are, the car, the office, the shower, or even if you're traveling, we're right here for you. Each Spaced Out Radio show can be found on iTunes, TuneIn, and on our YouTube channel, Spaced Out Radio Show. It's the perfect way for you to catch up on our shows. For more information, just head over to our website, spacedoutradio.com, and tune in to us today.
The views and opinions expressed by tonight's guest and topic of discussion do not necessarily represent the official policy or position of Spaced Out Radio, Spaced Out Weekend, Spaced Out Radio Limited, its hosts, syndicated carriers, or anyone associated with this broadcast. Would you like to connect with us? Head to spacedoutradio.com for all your latest show info. And hit us up on Twitter using the hashtag Spaced Out Radio. Now, back to Dave Scott and SOR.
Welcome back to the second hour of Spaced Out Radio tonight. I am your host, Dave Scott. Good to have you with us. Tomorrow night on the program, Dr. Lauren Belg is going to join us. We're talking near-death experiences. 9 p.m. Pacific, midnight Eastern Time at spacedoutradio.com. We want to remind you that you can follow us all over the internet on spacedoutradio.com, where we have a plethora of features for you, including joining the SOR Space Travelers Club for $5 a month. You can also shop at our Spaced Out Radio store, pick up a t-shirt, poster, or a sticker today, and you can read up on the Encounter online, where we have some really cool stories by our news editors, Eric Markham and Everett Thiemer. We're proud to be broadcasting on WQEE 99 Rock the Key down in Noonan, Georgia, home of The Walking Dead. We are also live on the United Public Radio Network, 107.7 FM in New Orleans and over 160 countries around the world. Thank you so much for tuning us in. We're also live on our website, spacedoutradio.com, KTLK, The Fringe FM, Renegade Talk Radio out of Las Vegas. And if you're listening in on Revolution Radio, remember the Double R Machine is a donation station financed by you, the valued listener. Head on over to freedomslips.com and donate today. Bill Cardwell has set the password for tonight in the SOR Space Travelers Club. Diaphanous. Diaphanous is your password. Make sure you use it wisely, Space Travelers, as Bill sets a password each and every night right here on the mighty SOR. Remember, you can always follow us on Twitter at Spaced Out Radio. Use the hashtag Spaced Out Radio if you want to connect with me live during the show as well. Give our Facebook page a like, Spaced Out Radio Show. You can tune us in on TuneIn, download this show and others on iTunes. We're also on TalkStream Live, Player.fm, RadioGuide.fm, and on Stitcher. Tonight we are talking Aleister Crowley. The man, the myth, the occult legend, if you want to call him that. Was he a spy? Was he just a Satanist who had a bunch of cult people following him? We'll find out more from author Richard Spence tonight. Richard and Eric Markham, who is also co-hosting with me tonight, are back. Welcome back, gentlemen.
Hi, Dave.
Hi there.
Right before the break, Richard, we were talking about sex magic, how Crowley was using it to try and find enlightened spiritual enhancement to just plain old fun.
Well, okay, here again there's a disclaimer. I've never tried it, so I can't tell you what it comes in. At least I don't think I have. But my understanding of sex magic, again, is that it's a means of utilizing the presumed spiritual or animal energy, however you want to describe it, I don't know. Maybe orgone, maybe that's what we're dealing with here. But the energy which is created during sex is then channeled, is the idea that you then use this into, I mean, a lot of sort of practical occult ritual to me, and again, by to me, I mean someone who's looking at it from the outside, who's looking at it as a kind of curious observer, seems to involve the idea that you have to build up a certain amount of energy. You know, it could be about, communicating or raising with various entities, but energy is always a very important part of this. And energy is one of those things that seems to be derived out of intense human emotion, fear, panic, but also lust and desire. And that the energy which is then used, this kind of fuel that you create, that the sex creates a fuel, but then it has to be directed towards something. And that could be directed towards, I'll give you an example of at least what I understand to be an application of sex magic for a ritual purpose that doesn't involve Crowley personally, but involves one of his, maybe some of the listeners know this, one of his followers, an American rocket scientist by the name of John Whiteside Parsons. Guy connected to the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, the guy that basically invented solid rocket fuel. Anyway, and after World War II, when Parsons was involved in forming, was a follower of Crowley, deeply immersed in this, he, his then girlfriend, and his then buddy, Lafayette Ronald Hubbard, yeah, that guy, L. Ron Hubbard, went out to the Mojave Desert to carry out a ritual that Crowley had written about and perhaps performed on his own, the Babylon working. And the idea was that through ritual sex magic application between, not so much between he and her, but with the young woman in question, their basic goal, as I understand it, was to, in essence, use that energy and those actions to open a portal to the other side and to incarnate the spirit of the Scarlet Woman Babylon into a child that would be born to that woman. So this was a way of trying to actually bring in and incarnate a deity in human form. But remember, this all sort of, reaching out to this other side. But it could be used for a number of other practices. And, during his World War I antics in the U.S. and activities in New York and traveling across, Crowley makes this whole giant road trip across the entire United States to the West Coast and then back to the East Coast. He makes trips down to New Orleans, his favorite city in America, by the way, he once proclaimed. And in this, he uses ample supplies of drugs, in particular mescaline and ether, and he engages in any variety of sexual acts. I think with his assorted Scarlet Women and others, and I think he was enjoying himself. But a lot of this he viewed as really sort of spiritual work. Ritualized sex, again, from an outsider's view, seems to be something rather different than just sort of plain recreational sex. It has a purpose beyond the act itself. What you're actually doing with your partner isn't particularly important other than providing the fuel for this greater aim that you're trying to achieve, which is what you have to be thinking about the whole time, which sounds to me a little bit like trying to think of baseball scores, but then keep your mind on other things that are going on. And it would seem to me to be something that would require patience and skill and practice. And I think, to me, in a way, it actually sort of speaks to his sort of dedication to this purpose, that he would take something as kind of basic and even sort of natural as sex, and even there, not on all occasions, but on many, to turn this into something which was to have a particular religious purpose to it, to have a ritual outcome that was supposed to be achieved. And I think he did that with a lot of other things that appeared to be casual around him as well. Something else, again, I guess, that makes him complicated.
Let's get to some audience questions here, if you don't mind, Richard. We're going to...
Sure.
Absolutely. It's going to be a lot of fun. Our audience, we love their participation in this show. This one starts off from Lisa. You say, Richard, that Crowley had money. He grew up with wealth. Was he in any way related to the Crowley's department stores?
I don't know whether the department store family is part of that. His family was involved in Crowley ales, in producing basically they were brewers. I guess that's the simplest way to put it. And I've heard about the department stores before, but I don't know whether that's a branch of the same family, or if it's a group that was close to him.
We can move on to another question, this one from Gail. Back to the Satanist reputation, did Crowley do blood sacrifices?
Well, if he never got caught for them. Here's an interesting thing to consider. So far as I know, Aleister Crowley never was arrested or charged with any crime other than being an undischarged bankrupt. He didn't spend any time in prison. In fact, this is the interesting thing we'll see, is that despite all of his notoriety and supposed infamy and all of his wicked behavior and all of the various things that he's accused of, the law and authorities never seem to take any real interest in that. Now, that could mean one of two things. It could mean that he never did them and there was nothing for them to take an interest in, or that he in some way enjoyed sufficient protection so that he didn't fear prosecution for them. There seem to be a lot of things. The thing with Crowley is this. Somewhere, amidst all of the sort of myth that has developed around him, he's become an historical figure, and once anybody becomes an historical figure, I don't care whether it's Aleister Crowley, or whether it's Hitler, or Lenin, or whether it's Abraham Lincoln, or whether it's, Benjamin Franklin, you name anyone who's achieved historical prominence. And you will find, if you start looking, that there is a mythology which is developed around this person. There are the Davy Crockett stories. There are all sorts of things that upon closer examination, it turns out they never did or they didn't do in that way. Because things begin to sort of attach themselves to people. So there have been, I've had this question before in other interviews and personally, if Crowley was a Satanist, and I'd have to say that the way I define it, I think he would talk about. I think he was conversant in it, and he may have tried it along with anything else. But was it the center of what he was doing? No. I don't see that. The idea, again, he was involved in child sacrifice. So there's even a story that his son, born in the 1930s, was killed in some sort of horrible occult working gone wrong. Well, you can never absolutely prove that a horrible occult working gone wrong didn't happen, but there's absolutely no evidence that it did, and the child who supposedly was destroyed in this, lived a very long life, I don't know if a happy life after that. Crowley produced any number of illegitimate offspring, one of which, a woman, by the way, who died in 2014 up in Oakland, California, Louise Mueller, who was born in 1920 as Astarte Lulu Panthea Shumway. That was her mother's maiden name. That was one of his illegitimate children, and there were others as well. And surprisingly, she, for an example, seems to have gone on and lived a relatively normal life. She was a faithful member of the Presbyterian Church. She taught English as a second language to adult learners in the Oakland school system. So I think there's a lot of things, and all of this seems to sound as if I'm constantly trying to defend Aleister Crowley, that there's anything bad about him. And so I suppose I should probably say something bad about him or something. What can we say? I've already pointed out that he was terrible with money. He had absolutely no money sense. He was a perennial mooch off of most of his friends, which drove many people away. He was, in terms of his relationships, especially with women, a cad and a heel of the first degree. There's just no getting around that. He would have been, my feeling is that he would have been a kind of fascinating friend to have, but he would have been one of those friends that, if you pardon the expression, is in many ways almost a curse to be your friend. You like them, but they're difficult. He was a tremendously difficult person. On the other hand, you can say that about a lot of other people, famous and not so famous. It's one of those things that comes with it. I don't think that makes him extraordinary. I actually think that makes him relatively human. And I think he went out of his way for years to say and do things that deliberately shocked and horrified people. And some of those things, for instance, engaging in blood sacrifice of animals, I would find it unlikely that he hadn't tried that. Was he ever involved in human sacrifice? Well, I don't know. He might have liked to imply. I think there was a part of him that would have sort of taken a thrill in making people think so. I mean, look, how often have any of us or people have, maybe tried to make themselves look tougher and meaner than they actually are, or without actually coming out and saying something, let it sort of be believed that they had done something, developing a sort of cred for himself. I mean, if nothing else, even if he was just posing as an occultist, even if most of this, I don't think most of it was a kind of act, you have to play to that. You have to build it up. But that, in the long run, became a curse to him. Because in the 1930s, when Crowley returns to England, having spent the better part of a decade essentially in exile from his home country, and that meant something to him, when he came back, he actually makes an attempt, and this is something else I discuss in the book, to try to redeem at least a part of his reputation. And he actually had some friends in the press who would try to help him. And it was virtually impossible for him to do, because such a picture had been formed of him. Here is this evil, devil-worshipping Aleister Crowley, and that was the image. Here is the person who spurns mores. Here's the person who is disreputable and horrible and engages in all of these awful things. And at that point, it was kind of pointless of him to try to explain anything away. You make your bed and you lie in it, and that's what he'd done. And he had created such an image for himself that there was really no correcting it. And that seemed to really hurt him in a way, if that's the right word for it, because it went against, to me, within Aleister Crowley, the occultist and the libertine, the man who spurned normal society, the man who showed contempt for morals and Christianity and everything else, there was, and I think he almost admits this in a couple of occasions, that what he really was, or what he wanted to be, was a kind of English gentleman. And that somewhere inside him was this kind of conservative English gentleman screaming to get out. I mean, and again, as I said at the beginning, people, there are a number of aspects to people, and the English gentleman was an aspect of his personality that seems to have been put aside and sort of, pushed to the corner to replaced with the public occultist and the public black magician, the horrible Aleister Crowley. And that's one of the things that really seems to have stung him in terms of what he felt was the work that he had done for England, and that was never and could never be appreciated because no one could see. Part of it was because he could never talk about it. And I think that's important to consider, is that there was, among other things, something called the Official Secrets Act. And the Official Secrets Act is no joke. It is still to this day a very powerful tool in the hands of the British government to keep people quiet about certain things, and most of them are willing to do so. But what it meant in effect is that any kind of work for the British government that he did, certainly anything touching upon intelligence, he was forbidden forever to discuss. And that, to me, explained why in his public statements, and where he would sort of come out and go, well, during the war I was really working for Britain, I was only pretending to work for the Germans, that he could never say much. He actually said more than he should have right there. I mean, he kind of violated it by that, but first of all, even acknowledging that British intelligence existed. And that's something that listeners might be interested in, is that everybody or many people know that MI6 is the service of James Bond, the British equivalent of the CIA, or the CIA being the American equivalent of MI6. It's acknowledged to exist today. There was a point in time when it wasn't MI6, and actually it's not. It's the Secret Intelligence Service, and its existence was never supposed to be mentioned. So you see, when he would come out and say that, I can't tell you exactly what I did, but I was working for the Crown. I was working for naval intelligence in the United States during the First World War. Well, right there, he's saying something that he shouldn't have. And that was one of those things that I think sort of negatively affected his relationship with some of his superiors, and one of the reasons why people didn't entirely trust him. But he never went too far. He didn't name names, and he never said exactly what he did. He talked around it. So he couldn't, it's as if you've done something that you can't talk about to defend yourself with. The type of thing, arguably, let's make an argument here, that if people knew what I really did, then they would realize that I was, that this whole image they have of me is not, at least not complete. Even if that image may be partly true, it's not complete. But I can't tell them. So they're really left to believe this kind of, self-made villain image that I've created for myself, and now I'm stuck with. So I guess I might as well run with it as well as I can. To me, that's what, in the end, and this didn't really, I think, sink in until I was finishing the book, that in his own way, and this is true for a lot of people, it's not unique to him, that's the tragedy to me of Aleister Crowley, is that he was a man of many accomplishments, but that some of those accomplishments, maybe his most important ones, were ones that, the world could never know.
Let's get to another question here, this one from BTO. Did Mr. Crowley ever deal with extraterrestrial or interdimensional beings? If so, do we know who they are?
Well, the being that comes up, the entity that he claimed contact with, that many people see as an alien, particularly the classic gray alien, is a thing called LAM, L-A-M. And in fact, there's a fairly famous sketch. You know, Crowley was an artist, among other things, and he drew a picture of LAM, this being, which I think anybody can now probably go out and Google it very quickly, Aleister Crowley LAM, L-A-M, and they'll get it. And it looks like, to me, it looks like a giant baby. But it has a very large head. That's about all you can really see in the picture, and there are people who look at that and go, well, you see, that was a gray alien, and therefore when he was involved in these magical workings and drawing and talking to spirits or gods or angels or demons, that actually these are aliens in disguise. You know, I think that's one of the views floating around out there, is that what we tend to think of as paranormal or supernatural entities are really just aliens messing with us in some new way. When I look at LAM, I mean, I can see how someone can look at that and think, well, that's kind of a, you know, it could be kind of a gray alien, but if you look at it closely, let's face it, it doesn't look exactly like what people tend to think aliens look like now, and that's because that's what we think they're supposed to look like. I mean, it could be. I don't see any reason to look at that and assume that it has to be. I don't know whether Crowley was drawing exactly what he saw, or his approach to art was, you know, sort of veered towards the abstract and the representational in some places. But that's one, which could be. And then it gets into the question is, well, you're dealing with extra-dimensional entities. Well, again, angels, gods, demons, spirits, whatever it is that you raise in magical workings, well, they got to be coming from somewhere, and it's not here. So I guess they are, by definition, extra-dimensional. But, you know, that's a term that gets thrown around a lot, but do we really know exactly what we mean? I mean, it goes back to this idea of what, I guess, an essential concept in occultism is, and it's very much, again, because it's essentially a religious concept. Every religion, at least as far as I know, or most of them, most of them, the basic belief here is that the world we see, the world we perceive with our senses, the phenomenal world, is an imperfect and incomplete version of a much larger world that we cannot see. That there is more to heaven than earth than our senses can take in. And that is where, through such things as meditation or ritual or drugs or any other means or combination of those two, we try to access that larger reality. I mean, for my way of looking at it, that's what every form of occultism, whether it's alchemy or, you know, hermetic rituals, or whether it is astrology, all of that is the idea is that through a kind of methodology other than the senses, you can access a larger reality. And I think that's always what it was that he and others around him were trying to do. The question is that larger reality another dimension? Is it another world? When we're talking about aliens and demons, are those kind of, or angels, or how can you tell them apart? You know, I suppose it's the magician's conundrum. You summon something up, and you ask it, well, are you an angel or are you a demon? And it goes, well, I'm an angel, of course. Well, is it telling you the truth or not? If it was a demon, he wouldn't tell you. Or what exactly is the difference between an angel and a demon except a name? I mean, even if you go back to the sort of biblical idea of Satan and his legions of demons, what did they all start out as? Well, fallen angels. So, on that basis, they are the same. So it's not a matter of so much of what they would be, but their attitude, which they have. So, Crowley, the other thing that this question, and it may be something we might get more into later, is that Crowley spent time when he was in America camping out at the far eastern end of Long Island, near Montauk Point. Now, I bet that got some people's attention, because one of the things that has developed in recent decades is a certain mythology about Montauk Point, the idea that Montauk was and is, in many people's minds, the site of secret government bases and experiments with everything involving extraterrestrials and time travel, you name it. And therefore, someone could see great, at least significance or possible significance in the fact that Crowley, way back in 1919, was camped out in the same space. So the sort of logic goes, well, if there are weird things going on in Montauk now, and Aleister Crowley was there, well, he being master of the weird, there must be a connection between the two. There might be. But this, to me, might be there's also another element of the story that gets lost under the idea about secret bases, is that when Crowley was there at Montauk Point in 1919, there were very real military bases. There weren't secret military bases, but they were bases, U.S. naval base, that was carrying out secret research on things like underwater communications and torpedoes. So when I look at this from the standpoint of Crowley the spy, when he's camped out near Montauk in 1919, I don't think it's necessary he's there to communicate with spirits or extraterrestrials. He may have been doing all kinds of magical workings, and they may have been quite serious, but his day job, I would strongly suspect, was to keep an eye on what the Yankees were doing there and to have a good cover story if anybody asked questions.
Let's get to another question from our audience. This one comes from Corey. She's not sure if you've heard this or not, but apparently it was quoted that Hillary Clinton was caught quoting Aleister Crowley. Did you hear about this? And if so, do you remember the quote?
I do not remember that. I wouldn't be surprised that it happened, but I have, of all the possible things I've heard about Aleister Crowley or Hillary Clinton, I have not heard that she quoted him. But I would not doubt that would be possible.
Mm-hmm. All right, let's move on to another one here. This one from #SpacedOutRadio on Twitter. This one comes from Rhonda. She is asking, did Aleister ever spend time in a psychiatric facility?
No, but one of his wives did. In fact, actually, two of them did, I think. It's this one. Here's something else. This gets into the mythology, is that every woman that Aleister Crowley married or was connected to in any length of time went mad or was institutionalized or became an alcoholic or a drug addict or killed herself. That isn't quite true. His first wife, Rose Kelly, who early on assisted him basically in the role of a medium, channeling spirits. She played an important role. She became an alcoholic. Now, did she become an alcoholic because she was married to Aleister Crowley? Maybe. I don't know. I didn't live with him every day. Or was she someone who was predisposed towards alcoholism and happened that, she lost a very young child, which would be something that, and, partly through her negligence, and her drinking, which, I didn't start her drinking, but it probably made it worse. She was, I believe, institutionalized for her alcoholism. I don't think she was ever entirely cured of that. Then later on in the 1920s, he married another woman, Maria de Miramar, and she was, he had her committed in Colney Hatch Insane Asylum. And, pretty much abandoned her there. Now, did he drive her crazy, or as other people noted, was she pretty much off, halfway there to begin with? That, again, would be questions you only know if you knew the people, and even then might not be able to answer them. But was he ever accused? I'm sure people thought he was crazy, but no, I have no knowledge of him being institutionalized, any more than him being imprisoned.
During his life, considering that he was considered a mooch, yet a cult follower, was there ever any sort of suicide or human rituals with him?
Did he attempt suicide? Is that what you mean? Or
yeah, or have any of his followers commit suicide? Like I think of a lot of these, cults. They all want to commit suicide together, or something along those lines.
the closest he ever had to actually running an operative cult. I mean, that was, that's probably something later on. Had he been around in the 60s, he probably would have run a cult. He founded, after World War I was over and his American interlude was done, and he briefly returned to England, he took what finances he still had available to him, and he invested those in buying a kind of rundown farmhouse in northern Sicily. And that he grandly called the Abbey of Thelema, And he invited his followers and other people and assorted hangers-on to come and live there, and he adorned the walls with his original paintings, and everyone was... And today, if we looked at it, it was kind of an early version of a hippie commune. And that's probably oversimplifying. It was to be run communally. Free love was the reign. Clothing optional in many cases, and of course, there was a lot of sex and drug taking and a lot of hangers-on. But it was all supposed to be about building a kind of new culture and attaining spiritual enlightenment. Is in every commune. And like most of them, it failed miserably in almost every respect. I mean, maybe there was some spiritual enlightenment that came out of it. But other than that, the general descriptions of it was that life there was fairly difficult and dirty and unhealthy. So there were followers there. In particular, there was a young man and his fiancée or wife, and I've certainly got them named in the book, and I'm trying to remember, who come there to stay for a while, and the fellow basically dies. The fiancée was so distraught about this that for the rest of her life, she blamed Aleister Crowley for killing her beloved. Because if he'd never come to this horrible place with this horrible man to live under these horrible conditions, he would be alive. And therefore, this is for the idea that he was killed in some sort of awful ritual gone awry. Well, Crowley had a simpler explanation for it. The water from the well was not particularly clean, and often basically carried cholera, or other pathogens, and the guy drank it, and he got sick, and he died. And Crowley's view is that I told him not to drink that water, and he did it anyway. And that's what happened. So there was, in his view, there was nothing magical about it. And the latter explanation from other descriptions of the place probably sounds about right. There may have been other deaths there. I think a couple of the children who were born there, maybe even one of Crowley's illegitimate children died as well. And the whole thing was bad. The other thing about that is that during this period, Crowley was sinking deeper and deeper into a heroin addiction, which seems to have, as those things do, impaired his judgment and his ability to keep things together. And then, of course, in 1922, he was unceremoniously kicked out of Italy, expelled from the island and his beloved commune by Mussolini's new fascist government. So that was one of those things that led, and there was actually a lawsuit, and there was a book written. I think the woman who wrote the book was Nina Hamnet, and that may not have been her, but she wrote, and I think it's a book called The Laughing Torso. Don't ask me why, but that's where Crowley is accused of essentially being responsible for his death and others. And it's not to say that everything that the woman said or that other people who said things about him were wrong, but keep in mind their actions were just as often motivated by grief or spite. You've got to blame somebody. So in terms of a suicide cult, no. I mean, the Abbey of Thelema, I'm not even sure you could have organized a mass suicide there. My sense of it, and certainly other people who probably looked at that more thoroughly, is that it just looks like a complete chaotic mess. Whatever grand schemes he had, his idea was this was going to become a kind of a college of occult knowledge. It was going to become the center of a kind of new spiritual community, and nothing like that occurred. It was, I think, one of the great failures and disappointments of his life. Were there followers or people who thought they were followers of him who committed suicide? Almost certainly. Did they commit suicide in his order? I've never seen anything to that extent. I don't think it was something that he would have encouraged. I have no doubt on that occasion he probably wished certain people dead, and sometimes they might have died, and whether his wish had anything to do with that, well, who knows?
I've got a question. I've got a good question from one of our listeners on the Spreaker chat, Trippin' Fool. He wants to know if Houdini and Crowley ever locked horns, because we know Houdini spent a lot of his time debunking psychics and spiritualists.
That is a great question. And it's a great question because the idea that Crowley and Houdini wouldn't lock horns over that issue because they agreed on it. Crowley absolutely shared Houdini's mistrust and disdain for fake mediums. In fact, he didn't seem to have cared for mediums as a whole. Now, that's kind of surprising, and that sort of surprised me. What would he possibly have against people who speak to the spirit world? Isn't that what he's trying to do? His dislike of them was based upon the same thing as Houdini's observations. Most of the people who claimed to speak to the spirits through seances were frauds. And therefore, from the standpoint, remember, of someone who views themselves as an actual practitioner of the arcane or occult arts, what these people do, what this legion of charlatans do, is they bring disrepute and ridicule upon the whole sphere. You know, it would be the one thing is that anyone who does what he does is then in some way now implicated with this mass of cheats and frauds. So he would hate them for that reason. He also seems to have disliked him in the idea that even those who actually did manage somehow to communicate with the spirits didn't know what they were doing and really weren't communicating with what they were thought they were communicating with. It's another one of those things that there's Crowley wrote. There's a little treatise published on his writings on the Ouija board, something which probably a lot of listeners have some at least passing acquaintance with, and use that for one thing. It's one of those things I guess he thought was a tool in certain, if you knew what you were doing, but otherwise you were just sort of messing around stupidly with something that you shouldn't be messing around with. And that if you were using the Ouija board or using a medium for that matter to talk to your dear departed great Aunt Tilly, you were basically being fooled because if the medium wasn't a fake, then what you thought you were talking to really wasn't your great Aunt Tilly. It was something impersonating her. So there again, there was a sort of fraud on the other side. But no, Crowley was well-versed, there are two things that sort of connect him with Houdini. Houdini is essentially a stage magician in many ways. He was that before he became the great escape artist, but he's a very skilled stage magician. Crowley is well-versed in that as well. And the other is that they had this both sort of visceral dislike of fakery, especially in the field of mediums. So rather than being people who would lock horns over that issue, they would be people who would collaborate over that issue. So one of the reasons why this is such an interesting question is that, to me, this is an unexplored aspect of Crowley's career, because given those common interests, not that they would agree upon everything, but given that there are points of a potential agreement and collaboration between them, and given that their presence in America and elsewhere overlapped, and furthermore, given that Houdini, guess what, also had a connection to British intelligence and viewed himself as a kind of crusading spy. In fact, he had a certain number of films that were made in the early 20s where he sort of takes on this spy performance. But Houdini, early on in the 20th century, did some work for British intelligence, or at least offered them some information, that given those connections, is there actually more to this? What I can't do, what I would love to be able to do, is to put those two guys in the same room together. And I would bet, or let's put it this way, I have a pretty good hunch that at some point, somewhere along the line, they were. and that their common interests and that their common intelligence links brought them together in at least some kind of consulting capacity. And to know more about that, to me, would be quite fascinating. And that's one of those things I think that could be maybe further delved into.
Well, wouldn't they have also been in Germany at about the same time?
Yeah, let's see, Houdini dies in 26, on Halloween of 26. And Houdini's connection to British intelligence, that's actually discussed in a couple of books. One of them, I think, is Sloman and Kalush's recent biography on Houdini. And then I think that also may be mentioned in a book called M, written by Andrew Cook, which is about an interesting character that probably nobody's heard of outside who hasn't read that book, a guy by the name of William Melville. And William Melville was a longtime chief of Scotland Yard. You know, think of Sherlock Holmes and Inspector Lestrade, but a kind of smarter version. And Melville was a chief inspector of Scotland Yard who led it during the tumultuous 1880s and 1890s. And if you, again, want to talk about people who had a flexible morality and a willingness to do just about anything to achieve their ends, that's William Melville. And Melville appreciated that Houdini had particular skills. I mean, his ability to escape from jails, etc. But he also knew that Houdini was going, and this is around the beginning of the 20th, I think around 1900, 1901. Houdini was going on a European tour to Germany and Russia and elsewhere. And there he was going to be received, he was fairly famous, by officials and police officials and others who would let him do things like go into their jails and see if he could break out, and he always did. And Melville basically just enlisted him again to keep his eyes and ears open, to note who he met, to provide just sort of basic intelligence. And then apparently an agreement was worked out. Now, whether that ever continued much longer than that, I don't know. I haven't seen any particular evidence of that. But once a connection like that is made, it tends to endure. And so that there was a connection, even if a slight and temporary connection, between Houdini and British intelligence, and that Crowley then later is working in the same sphere, and that they share this common... I mean, Houdini, for all of his debunking, the reason why he's a debunker is why? Because he's fascinated with the occult. I mean, Houdini, as far as I can tell, wasn't trying to prove that there is no afterlife and that there are no spirits and that there is no other world. He was simply expressing his disdain and hostility towards people who use that for a matter of fakery and profit.
Well, yeah, it was Conan Doyle's wife that gave this long drawn-out letter supposedly dictated by Houdini's mother after she had passed, and Houdini's like, yeah, but my mother never spoke English. So from that point on, Conan Doyle...
Well, and that's, there's another, Arthur Conan Doyle, the best known as the creator of Sherlock Holmes, was himself fascinated with all things occult and, believed in fairies and believed in mediums. And the real issue that sort of destroyed their friendship, and that some people even argue was at least maybe responsible for Houdini's death or contributed to it, was his campaign not against mediums per se, but against one in particular, a woman named Marjorie Crandon, also known as Mina Crandon. And she was married to a very wealthy, established surgeon in Boston. There's a whole story about that couple who have a number of rather creepy things about them. But nevertheless, she was sort of famed as a medium, and that was, at the time of his death, that's who it is that Houdini was sort of determined to expose and really wanted to try to get. And when he died, in the fall of 1926, expiring on, what they thought was fittingly on Halloween of that year. The Crandons were ecstatic. Okay, they believed that they had been avenged. I mean, their view towards that was that, he had come after us and the spirit world has reached out and destroyed him. That's why, if you ever see the story that in some way Houdini was murdered by the spiritualists, that somehow these people, I'm not really sure how they could have pulled it off. It was a curious way to murder someone if they did, but then I suppose spiritualists can be sneaky. But they certainly, if they could have, they would have. I don't think there's any doubt about that. But there's another element to this, okay? Because I mentioned Marjorie Crandon and her feud with Houdini to tell a story about Crowley, which goes back a few years. In one of the British intelligence officials in New York during that war that Crowley met was the second in command of the British intelligence office, which was working out of that very same British consulate that we were mentioning earlier on. And he was a fellow by the name of Norman Graham Thwaites. So think of Norman Graham Thwaites in 1917 as the number 2 man in the MI6 station in New York. Now, Thwaites definitely knew who Crowley was. The other thing that Thwaites mentions in his own autobiography of the war years is that he, Thwaites, had a long-time casual interest in spiritualism. Mentioned that his mother was interested in it, and he dabbled in it. And he mentions this incident. He never gives it an exact time frame, but I'd fit it somewhere 1917, maybe 1918. And there's a party at his apartment in New York, and various people are invited. And one of them he describes as a young woman, and somebody brings out a Ouija board, and she begins using it and goes into a trance and starts speaking in German. And I won't tell the whole story, but what it comes out as is that somehow she seems to have tapped in to this German spy network which has been involved in the theft of passports. And this whole episode is then used to actually, according to Thwaites, break up part of an actual German spy ring. And he recounted it because he thought it was one of the strangest things that had happened in his wartime experiences, and he doesn't purport to explain it. Now, in the autobiography, he never mentions the woman's name, but in another magazine article that he wrote in the 1920s, he describes the same incident, and the title of that is My Seance with Marjorie the Medium. So he's basically, and there's only one medium who used that name, so somehow at the very beginning of her career, because I don't think she really started with the medium thing until around 1918, Thwaites is connected to Marjorie Crandon, and she even marries the doctor in that year. Now remember, this took place at a dinner party, and there are various people there, and he doesn't really name most of them. Once again, I would have a hunch that at that dinner party, where a very early Marjorie Crandon is getting into her medium act, and intelligence officer Norman Thwaites is the host, and others are involved, that I would kind of suspect, even though it's not mentioned, that Aleister Crowley was somewhere in the room. And that's as close as I can get to sort of putting him in Houdini. They're not in the same room. But what that would mean, and even through the connection between Thwaites and Crandon, is that Crowley was aware of this same medium and perhaps had met her, this woman who will become the nemesis of Harry Houdini's life. So somewhere in this, one of the little sort of, maybe it will never be uncovered and maybe there's nothing to it, but somewhere in that, I'm fairly concerned, is a story. There's more to be said about a connection between Crowley, maybe not a relationship, but a connection between Crowley and Houdini based upon their common opposition to mediums.
We got about 2 minutes left before we got to go to break here, Richard. Do you think then that maybe what Aleister Crowley had perfected was maybe his own kind of magic and trickery on people?
Well, the one thing that comes across to me, maybe we get back to this later, is the one thing he was really good at was hypnotism. And that the basis of much of his interactions with people, and I think many of the things that were accounted as his occult powers, were basically connected to his ability to hypnotize people individually and in groups. So, for instance, one of the things that Crowley would experiment with and claim that he had done or almost done on occasion was to make himself invisible. Now, whether that meant that he actually became transparent, which is a neat physical trick to carry off, or whether it meant that in some way he simply made other people unaware of him. In other words, you're still there, but no one sees you. Now, how could you carry out a trick like that? How could you be there sitting at the same table, but people no longer see you? Well, possibly with the right hypnotic suggestion, perhaps administered with the help of the drugs that you just put in their food at dinner, something else that he did on a number of occasions, that might have worked. And that's one of those things that I suspect is a key to a lot of the things that he did, not to discount the magical element, but that in some cases, the magic is hypnosis.
That's daring. That is very, very daring, my friend. Like, you have to have, you know, a lot of guts or a lot of confidence to pull something like that.
Huh?
Wow. You're listening to Space Out Radio. We're talking Aleister Crowley tonight with author Richard Spence. We're going the distance on this talk. The preacher, Eric Markham, is also co-hosting with me tonight, joining us along for the ride. We always appreciate when the preacher is with us as well, giving his scientific outlook on absolutely everything, even though he had to trim up his beard a few weeks ago. Still upset about that, preach. But that's okay. Don't forget, during the break, check out on our website, spacedoutradio.com, the latest on the first annual Spaced Out Radio Caribou Paracon. That will be a very good weekend, September 29th, October 1st, right here at 108 Mile Ranch, British Columbia, as we celebrate everything weird, strange, in BC's heartland. I hope you can make the trek up here and spend it with me, because I want to meet every single one of you as well. You're listening to Spaced Out Radio. I am your host, Dave Scott, joined by the preacher, Eric Markham. More Aleister Crowley coming up right after this. Looking for a great weekend getaway this fall? Hi there, this is Dave Scott. Come on up to the heart of British Columbia for the first annual Spaced Out Radio Caribou Paracon, being held at the Spruce Hills Spa and Resort in 108 Mile Ranch, British Columbia. Speakers from all over North America are coming to discuss Bigfoot, UFOs, ghosts, and intuitiveness for the 3-day event, September 29th to October 1st. For more information, go to spacedoutradio.com and click on the Caribou Paracon banner and book your tickets today. Come to BC, where the paranormal is waiting for you.
The SOR Sightlines is a place for you to find answers to your strange experiences. Hi there, this is Mike Schmidt. If you have had an encounter with ghosts, UFOs, Bigfoot, ETs, or anything else that doesn't make sense, head to spacedoutradio.com and file a Sightlines report. All information you give is 100% confidential, and I will personally help you find the answers you need. SOR Sightlines, your answers are a click away.
Have you got your Cosmic Passport? If you need one, tune in to Cosmic Passport on Spaced Out Weekend. This is Elizabeth Anglin, ET experiencer, spirit medium, and host of Cosmic Passport. Each weekend I'll be bringing you interviews and support from other paranormal experiencers, and the best in intuitive spiritual guidance from across the globe. It's all happening starting at 9 p.m. Pacific Time, midnight Eastern, on spacedoutradio.com.
Hi there, I'm Butch Witkowski, lead investigator with U4 Cop, on the final Monday of every month. you can listen to me and host Dave Scott on Spaced Out Radio's Strange Days. We're going to get to the heart of the matter when it comes to what's happening out there. People are seeing and experiencing things from ET contact to Bigfoot, and I want to hear about it. Your experiences are what we investigators need to help solve these unknown mysteries. So tune in at spacedoutradio.com to the final Monday of every month from Butch Witkowski's Strange Days.
This is your medium, Joanna, from Spaced Out Weekend, 2 mediums and a large. I would love it if you would come and join us with host James Tyson every other Sunday on Spaced Out Weekend. Together, we will take your calls and your questions live. Our goal is to provide you with a positive outlook on deep questions that you may have. Questions regarding love, relationships, money, or whatever else is on your mind. Come and check us out at spacedoutradio.com.
This is Eric Markham, news editor for the Spaced Out Radio's The Encounter Online. We have put together a great team of writers and journalists from all over the world to bring you top-quality paranormal stories. From alien encounters to the latest conspiracies, you won't find any of that fake news here. True stories and top-notch reporting as we look to bring these experiences to the mainstream. The Encounter Online, only at spacedoutradio.com.
Patrolling the Pacific Northwest, we are always on the lookout for the strange and unassuming stories that real people are experiencing. Hi, I'm Vincent Zunza from Pacific North Weird. Me and Alexandra Sullivan have teamed to bring to you those odd stories that never seem to make it into the mainstream. Stories so weird that will leave you scratching your head wondering, is this real? It's as real as it gets with Pacific North Weird. You can watch our videos right here at spacedoutradio.com.
Become more intimate and interactive with Spaced Out Radio. Join our Space Travelers Club with your new membership. For $5 a month, we'll provide you with special access to the website, monthly prize draws from books to psychic readings, along with monthly newsletter, private interviews, and more. Sign up today to be part of Spaced Out Radio's experience.
Looking for a place to advertise at a very reasonable cost? Look no further than Spaced Out Radio. SpacedOutRadio.com has an advertising tab that you can click to check out our daily, weekly, and monthly packages to play on the radio, or our website including social media. From commercial spots to banners, we have it all. Check out our competitive pricing today.
Don't have time to listen to Spaced Out Radio live? Wherever you are, the car, the office, the shower, or even if you're traveling, we're right here for you. Each Spaced Out Radio show can be found on iTunes, TuneIn, and on our YouTube channel, Spaced Out Radio Show. It's the perfect way for you to catch up on our shows. For more information, just head over to our website, spacedoutradio.com, and tune in to us today.
You hear footsteps in the empty room above you. A rocking chair begins rocking by itself. Don't be afraid of the things that go bump in the night. Reach for Spirit Storybox, the iPhone app the Huffington Post UK called the only ghost hunting app you will ever need. Spirit Storybox. The spirits are telling their stories. Are you listening?
Strange creatures lurking in the night, the sounds of wood knocking in the forest, odd happenings right out of a fictional world. These are the reports I love. Hi there, this is author Ronald Murphy, and I would love it if you join me and Spaced Out Radio host Dave Scott the second Wednesday of every month on our journey into the unknown land of cryptozoology at spacedoutradio.com. From Mothman to Frogman and everything in between. Hey, they don't call me the crypto guru for nothing.
Did you know that Spaced Out Radio runs 7 days a week? Hi, it's James Tyson from Spaced Out Weekend. Every Saturday and Sunday night, starting at 9 p.m. Pacific, midnight Eastern, you can join me and my guests for some great chatter about what's going on out in the universe, or even in that dark part of the basement you really don't want to go back into. Well, let's find the answers to your experiences together. So come on up to Uncle Jimbo's cabin on the weekend. For more information, look us up at spacedoutradio.com.
The views and opinions expressed by tonight's guest and topic of discussion do not necessarily represent the official policy or position of Spaced Out Radio, Spaced Out Weekend, Spaced Out Radio Limited, its hosts, syndicated carriers, or anyone associated with this broadcast. You're listening to Spaced Out Radio with Dave Scott. Follow Dave on Twitter at Spaced Out Radio and hashtag Spaced Out Radio, and on Facebook Spaced Out Radio Show. Now, back to the program.
A child grew up too fast, went running wild. Now we don't know who to pray to.
Welcome back to the final hour of Spaced Out Radio tonight. I am your host, Dave Scott. So great to have you along for the ride. Tomorrow night, we get into near-death experiences. Dr. Lauren Belg is going to join us. It's going to be an interesting show indeed as we talk about life on the other side. 9 p.m. Pacific, midnight Eastern Time at spacedoutradio.com. We want to say hello to everyone listening in on the United Public Radio Network, live on 107.7 FM in New Orleans and over 150 countries around the world. Good to have you with us. We're also live down in Noonan, Georgia on WQEE 99 Rock the Key. Great to have you rocking with us as well. Ryan O'Neill, you put on a hell of a show down there. Thank you so much for letting us be a part of it. We're also live on KTLK, The Fringe FM, Renegade Talk Radio out of Las Vegas. And if you're listening in on Revolution Radio, remember the Double R Machine is a donation station financed by you, the valued listener. Head on over to freedomslips.com and donate today. Bill Cardwell has set the password for tonight in the SOR Space Travelers Club. Diaphanous. Diaphanous is your password. Make sure you use it wisely, Space Travelers, as Bill sets a password each and every night right here on the mighty SOR. Hey, if you haven't checked us out on social media yet, we are all over the place. You can go on Twitter, at Spaced Out Radio. Use the hashtag Spaced Out Radio if you want to connect with us live during the show again as well. Give our Facebook page a like, Spaced Out Radio Show. You can tune us in on TuneIn, download this show and others on iTunes. We're also at spacedoutradio.com, where we have a plethora of features for you, including joining the SOR Space Travelers Club for just $5 a month. Read up on the encounter online by our editors, Eric Markham and Everett Thiemer. You can also head to the Spaced Out Radio store. Be like Teresa. Just go crazy in there. Pick up some stickers, a poster that I will autograph, t-shirts. We got it all so far. So make sure you check out our store today. Tonight we've been talking Aleister Crowley all night. What an interesting man indeed. Author Richard Spence is with us to discuss Aleister Crowley, along with my co-host tonight, Eric Markham from the Encounter Online. Preacher, Richard, how you doing?
Doing fine,
okay.
Dave.
Wonderful. Wonderful. I am very interested in learning about the hypnotism part, because you said you wanted to go a little bit more in depth with that he was actually using hypnotism to show that he could disappear in front of people and to really play with people's minds.
Well, I'm not a hypnotist either, any more than I'm an occultist. But when I was working on the book, this is what sort of brought that to mind. I was discussing various things, episodes with Crowley, and his efforts at invisibility to sort of blend into the background to the point that he wasn't there. His ability in some cases that noticed me of just being able to get people to do what he wanted them to do. And I was talking about this with a fellow who was, or at least claimed to be, a hypnotist, and he even had done this professionally. And so he's listening to it, and he goes, well, the only thing that I hear, that all of this to me just sounds like hypnotism. It just sounds like he was very skilled at being able to induce trance states in susceptible people or people around him individually, and he thought that the more challenging part is that he could do this with a group of people. And I hadn't really thought of it that way. But his explanation was that, I think that's what's going on. And in fact, the same fellow had an even more challenging idea. He goes, to me, he was saying, that most of the stuff that passes for, let's say, occult or magic rituals looks like the basis of a hypnotic trance. In some cases, one in which is either an outward agency or self-hypnosis. So maybe I can put that better. His theory was that in a lot of occult workings and a lot of magical actions or exercises, the whole point of the ritual is to induce a kind of self-hypnosis. That people are basically putting themselves into a hypnotic trance through the ritual itself. Now, I'm sure you'd get a fair amount of argument from people about it, and I'm not sure how one would test it or how you would tell. But I do again think that not necessarily universally, but in many cases, there's something to that. And I think the other thing that would kind of suggest to me that that's the case with Crowley, again, not always, but sometimes, was, it goes back to his use of drugs. And his use of drugs often in what seems to me in a kind of experimental way. So, for instance, I think I mentioned previously his inviting people for dinner and putting drugs in their food. Well, one that he did that with was mescaline. So, mescaline, the synthesized form of peyote, which I'm certain people have heard of. Now, here's an interesting thing. Again, going back to good old World War I, 100 years ago, I think a century ago, when Aleister Crowley was running loose around Manhattan, one of the things that he learned was that the Park Davis Pharmaceutical Labs in Detroit, Michigan, had recently learned how to synthesize the active ingredients from peyote to basically come up with what we know today as mescaline. And therefore, when he went on his road trip across the United States and into Canada, part of it actually visited Vancouver and Victoria on his way back down the West Coast, he went up to Detroit, made a special trip to go there, and bought a rather large store. I think, by one description, he bought all that Park Davis actually had. Now, keep in mind, these were different times with different laws, and he could do that. So basically, for some months or years afterwards, I don't know how long the stash lasted him, but he had a bag of mescaline, which he carried along with him, and he had his latest Scarlet Woman, that she was traveling with him on the train, and they indulged in recreational and ritual sex in various places, usually sort of adding the kicker of mescaline. So he had a fairly good supply of it. One of the things that Crowley liked to do, among other things, was cook, apparently. And one of the things that he thought he was a fairly decent cook at were what the British call curries, a kind of spicy meal, I guess, at least roughly based upon the Indian original. So, one of the reasons why curries were good for this exercise is because the strong flavors in it covered up other things. So he would have people over for dinner, and he would put a certain amount of mescaline in the food. On these occasions, he presumably wouldn't eat the food himself or make sure his wasn't dosed because he had to sit back and record what happened. So what he was interested, remember, this was a kind of scientist's approach to it. And it's one of those things, Crowley, remember, viewed magic as a combination of art and science. He always viewed himself, not only as a seeker of spiritual truth, but also as a kind of scientist probing the fringes of knowledge. So one of the things was, okay, what would be the effect of this drug, a certain amount of the drug put in the food, how much went into the food, how many people ate it, what were the different effects, let's say, between a 100-pound young woman and, let's say, a 250-pound older male? Were the effects the same? Were they different? To what degree did, let's say, gender and age and weight? I mean, the type of thing you'd want to study in that case. Now, he supposedly took copious notes on this, which were digested in one of his books, one of his Libers. I think this was like number 19, called The Cactus. Guess why it was called The Cactus? That's one of those, at least it may have turned up recently, but at the time that I was working on the book some years ago, not quite a decade ago, putting it together, that was one of Crowley's books that was known to have existed and been compiled in America that was no longer in any known collection. It had sort of disappeared. Now, you got to think about what kind of little compendium of knowledge that would have been. I mean, assuming that he did enough of these experiments and kept his notes carefully enough, here was a basic description of what this psychoactive drug would do to different people, again, of ages, sexes, and sizes, in different amounts put into food. I came across that, the first thing that came to my mind, and this, I'm not sure if this may say something about my mind, is MK Ultra. And I'm sure, again, many people out there have heard of that, but for the uninitiated, MK Ultra was the code name for a CIA operation which had many, many projects and sub-projects, which functioned under that and other names through the 1950s and 1960s, and was designed to use LSD and other psychedelic drugs and other substances and hypnosis in order to create enhanced interrogation techniques for intelligence purposes, and also to create things like split personalities and people who could commit murders and not realize it, and competing compartmentalized personalities in which you'd have two people inside of you, to which information could be entrusted to one, while the other one could be tortured and know nothing about it. Those are all sort of practical applications. So, and these were similar type of things. The idea of combining, I mean, the thing that constantly runs through the MK Ultra experiments is hypnosis and drugs. Hypnosis and drugs in a way to manipulate human minds to get people to do what you want to them. You know, the word for that is mind control. So here's what you have to wonder. You don't know, you just have to wonder. Was Crowley's work back 100 years ago, even decades before half a century before the 1950s almost, was that a kind of pioneering work in mind control? And was he doing that for his own amusement? Was he doing it for some grander occult purpose? Or was he doing it because he thought this might be information that would be useful to other people in intelligence? A means to control and manipulate what people were thinking and how they were acting, in most cases, without their knowledge. And it would, it's a tempting idea, and I would say that it's no more than that the roots of MK Ultra somehow go back to a dinner party in New York at Aleister Crowley's apartment in Greenwich Village in 1916. That's probably saying too much. But I think at the very least what it suggests is that he was, remember I've used this word pioneer, that he was a pioneer in recreational drugs, in popularizing the use of drugs. Well, I mean, let's put it this way. If you go back, let's say, to Timothy Leary and, the apostle of LSD in the 1960s, Timothy Leary was, talking about LSD as a recreational drug, but what he was really talking about, the whole idea of tune in, turn on, and drop out, was spiritual enlightenment. It's the same sort of Crowleyite message. That's, again, why Crowley would probably have been a more popular guy in the 60s than he was in the 1920s. But if nothing else, I think that what he was doing then, a century ago, looks to me like, if nothing else, an early pioneering attempt to see how drugs like mescaline could be used in some sort of practical way. In other words, instead of just being a way for people to have a trip and enjoy themselves, or not enjoy themselves as the trip may be, that what kind of use can we put to this? I mean, that's the type, and see, that's the very kind of question that comes back to this whole idea as to why anybody, and a practical intelligence officer would be interested in occultism or the rest, and magic. I mean, what would be the point of it? Well, what if it works? I mean, now, that's not arguing that it does. I mean, one can either assume that that's entirely possible or it's a complete absurdity, but you don't know. And the only way that you would know would be to put it to some kind of test, to actually put it in a situation where you could try it again, the whole idea, the scientific method of getting a replication of results. But to do that, you have to pay some time and attention to it. But imagine the potential gains if it did. So let's put it in a very simple sense. When people usually think of magic, especially black magic, what else comes to mind but a death curse, right? You can put a curse on someone, use a voodoo doll, stick a pin in it, kill them. Now, just imagine for a moment, put all moral scruples aside, of course, and then imagine for a moment how perfect that would be for targeted assassinations. No more gunmen with that big heavy rifle and all the potential ballistics evidence hiding up in a tower somewhere. No. All you have to be is maybe hundreds, maybe thousands of miles away, and to be able to kill by thought, to kill by will. You know, there was a recent book that came out by John Ronson, which was made into a not particularly good movie called Men Who Stare at Goats. I don't know how many people saw about it. It was about the U.S. military's experiments with sort of psychic abilities and telekinesis, etc. And it was kind of played semi for laughs in this case. But what the whole point of Men Staring at Goats, what that title was about, was, well, why were they staring at goats? They were trying to stop their hearts. The point was, it's kind of like the weaponization of the evil eye. Could you, through sheer force of will, cause a physiological change in that animal, in any organism, that would kill it? Now, why would you be interested from a military application or an intelligence application in killing a goat? Well, if you can stop the heart of a goat, you can, with a little more practice and a little more energy and a little more focus, stop the heart of a person. The ability to kill someone by looking at them. Imagine the potential applications to the world of secret activities. Imagine how much easier that would make an assassination. But there's a flip side to that, too. If you could, through force of will, kill, if you could stop a heart from beating, then by the same sort of logic, you could use your will to do what? To start it. See what you're beginning to get close to in things like that? You're beginning to get close to what it was that old Victor Frankenstein was looking for, the secrets of life and death. And that goes back to what every self-respecting alchemist through the ages has been working for. The goal of, the real goal of occultism, of what we call occultism, the real goal of magic and all of these spells and practices isn't just to get a demon to help you out here do that. It's to achieve immortality. The ultimate work of alchemy was not turning lead into gold. That was a parlor trick. The real goal was to transform the self and to achieve the immortality that the belief in this system that Adam and Eve were cheated of in Eden when they were denied to be able to eat from the tree of life. And to achieve that would then, equal the playing field with God, because then you would have become that which was denied to you. So this gets into some pretty sort of deep and spooky areas in this case, but it's this fascinating, and Crowley, again, was a person who was, you know, however much he might have been play acting in some parts or not, he was steeped in this stuff. He was knowledgeable in it. He was the one who would, if you wanted to know whether something like this might work, that was the kind of go-to guy. And that's why I think these little details matter so much in sort of piecing history together. You know, the saying, the devil is in the details. Well, he probably is, but so is a lot of the real story. And it's only sometimes by finding those things that you can piece it together.
Let's get to a couple questions from our audience here. This one comes from Gail. She is asking, how is it that someone whose behavior was so egregious has become so famous and caused people to spend so much time on his life?
Well, yeah, I mean, why are we sitting around here for 3 hours on a Thursday night talking about him? Because he becomes an object, I guess, in some way of morbid fascination or just in fascination. It's in his, you know, one of the things, again, it's this question, this distinction between fame and infamy. And, you know, arguably there's only fame, and then there's just, you know, the sort of fame for negative things as opposed to more positive ones. You know, Albert Schweitzer becomes famous as a humanitarian. Aleister Crowley becomes famous as an occultist and alleged Satanist. But it's still fame. You get known. And sometimes, again, as in Crowley's cases, you get known too well for certain things that you can't throw off. It's, you can describe it to a lot of things. If you see Aleister Crowley as a symbol of human evil, then you're fascinated with evil. And to some degree, who isn't? Let's face it. The villain in every story is generally a much more interesting character than the hero. Heroes are limited in what they can do. Heroes always have to be good. The villain doesn't. The villain has much more flexibility. In some ways, arguably, things like literary and film villains allow us to vicariously do all the wicked things we might think about, but really don't have the guts to do, or perhaps the better nature to do in some cases. So one of the things about Crowley, to those people who see themselves as iconoclasts and as rebels and as people who challenge the existing system, he becomes a kind of hero, or really what he becomes is a martyr. Because from that respect, as an example of someone who challenged the status quo, Crowley doesn't triumph. He becomes a martyr. He isn't entirely defeated by that, but, he doesn't achieve, Thelema does not replace Christianity. When he dies in 1947, he is relatively little known. He has few, he still has some loyal followers. But, the great ambition he had to become the prophet of a new religious aeon, let's face it, didn't happen. Maybe it wasn't supposed to happen in his lifetime. Maybe it never would. But he then became, I think, someone who was seen. That's why, presumably, along with a lot of other people like Sigmund Freud, if I recall, he was picked to be one of those faces that showed up on Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. What people have to remember is that Aleister Crowley is only one of a lot of people there, but the mere fact that he's there is a suggestion that he had attained, if not exactly immortality, he had achieved a certain degree of fame that lived on long after him. That is, his reputation has kind of grown. One of the reasons for that maybe is that, whether it's good, bad, or indifferent, beginning in the 1960s, cultural changes in Western society have made everything that Crowley stood for and proclaimed much more palatable. Let's say that maybe it isn't quite wholly acceptable, but it's much more palatable and discussable today than it was then. And therefore, he hasn't exactly become mainstream, but the world has kind of turned more in his direction. His Aeon of Horus hasn't materialized, but on the other hand, things like, well, let's put it this way, what has happened in terms of sexual identities and social acceptance of everything from pansexuality and drugs and etc. All of that has certainly, But that being said, I don't know that if Aleister Crowley was somehow to return from the grave and come back and see everything that has been made out of him and how the world is now, and I've discussed it with a couple of other people, I'm not sure he would like it. I think part of him would be sort of maybe gratified that there had been those changes. But, I think if he came back today, he would hate things just as much as he did back then. He would find something else that would, I think the sheer conceit and pretensions of modern people would probably irritate him as much as those of his contemporaries. Crowley was, he was a man out of time and place in many respects. There was that part of him that wanted to live the life of an English gentleman, but, he jettisoned that idea at some point, and he was never going to get back to it. He was, and maybe this is another one of those little keys to him, he was a malcontent. He was never going to be happy. There was nothing in the world that would ever make him happy. That's why he was looking for what? The other one.
Let's get to another question here on Spaced Out Radio from the SOR Space Travelers Club, all the way from Australia. Aussie Rob is asking, could Aleister Crowley have been working on his own version of Stargaters, ESP, and could that have been where he was getting his drugs from the government?
Well, if you go back, if you look at his American interludes, he didn't get the drugs from the government. He just went and bought them from the pharmaceutical companies that made them, or he bought them. Some people may be interested that in that period, apparently his favorite recreational drug, I mean, what it was that he took for fun was ether. Which sounds, ether is not really tends to be a favorite drug today. That's kind of, it seems to me like maybe one small step above huffing gasoline. But nonetheless, he enjoyed the effects of that. I think I mentioned before that by the 1920s and for the rest of his life, he was pretty much a hopeless heroin addict. He tried attempts to kick it. That never lasted, and he died an addict in 1947. Now, there is a case where, in a sense, he did get his drugs from the government. It goes back, though, I mean, the thing is that for Crowley, heroin really doesn't seem to have been a recreational drug. Because the basic reason he started using it was that he suffered from asthma from the time he was a child. Now, one of those things that I don't think anybody's doctor would prescribe today if you had asthma or if your child had asthma is that, well, you should start giving them heroin. But that was the advice then. Heroin, apparently, was quite effective. I guess before inhalers, you shot up smack, and that would alleviate the symptoms. So the basic reason, at least his explanation, as to why he took heroin in the amount to become addicted was in response to his asthma. Apparently fixed or worked on the asthma, but he became addicted, and you know how that goes. Now, by the 1930s, again, when he's back in England, and this is sort of the latter, this is kind of like the downhill side of his life. And at that point, I think around 34 or 35, as I mentioned, he is sort of drawn into English bankruptcy court. He has no, his inheritance is long since spent. Most of his friends he has relatively few people who are willing to pay his bills. And so he's judged a bankrupt. And he is never unjudged a bankrupt by the time he dies for the rest of his life. Now, here's the interesting thing. He doesn't end up on the street. He doesn't become a homeless guy living in a cardboard box somewhere off Piccadilly. No, he doesn't live lavishly by any means, but he always has an abode to stay in, a room or a boarding house. In the latter part of his years, we lived in a series of private small hotels or boarding houses. He obviously has food on the table. He has clothes to wear. He has some money in his pocket. And every week, he would get a package of heroin from a Harley Street chemist. And one of the ways he could do that is that he had registered as a hopeless addict. And if you registered as a hopeless addict, well, you could buy heroin at least, or someone could buy it for you. And since he had no visible income, like everything else, somebody was paying for it. Now, he did have some friends and benefactors, but I think there that this is another indication of Crowley's friends in high places, this sort of hidden hand that emerged to help him out in dire circumstances. So they didn't rescue him from his addiction, and they couldn't, and they didn't rescue him from his bankruptcy, but they did keep him from starving, and they did keep him warm and clothed and shot up with a sufficient amount of drugs to function, and he was still there and potentially useful to them. I guess that could lead to a question of, how is it that an aging, failed occultist apparently and hopeless drug addict could possibly be of help to anybody, let's say when the next war started in 1939? Well, here's another interesting story which is discussed more fully in the book. When the war starts, Crowley receives a message from Admiral Godfrey, who is the new head of British naval intelligence. Now, here's maybe one of these things I should make a little more clear. That there are different there isn't just British intelligence, like there's not just American intelligence. You know, there's the CIA, and there's the NSA, and there's the DIA, and there's a whole variety of other agencies. Maybe there's one you haven't heard of. Intelligence is a house with many rooms. And British intelligence is the same. So there's MI6, and there's MI5, and then there's a separate entity. There was the Admiralty's Intelligence Division, Naval Intelligence. Remember, the British Empire was really based upon its naval supremacy. So the Naval Intelligence Division was every bit as powerful. In fact, I'd argue in that part, certainly in the First World War, even maybe more powerful than the newer services, MI5 and MI6. In his wartime work in America in World War I, Crowley is clearly connected, most obviously, to naval intelligence. That's the entity he was connected with, and therefore, it's kind of interesting that when a war starts again, the new director of naval intelligence sends him a greeting and tells him, you know, you should drop by and you should see a person, a Captain Lang, and you should go and talk to him. Now, that raised the question as who Captain Lang is. So you do a little investigation there, and you find out that Captain Lang was the fellow who oversaw the branch of British naval intelligence that dealt with interrogation of prisoners of war. Now, does that mean that Crowley waltzed down there and they gave him a job and they gave him a commission? No, he never got any. But it's interesting that the head of naval intelligence, and you know who the head of naval intelligence personal aide was? Ian Fleming. But that's another story. And then he's called in. I mean, they were still aware he was there. What did they want him for? Why would they call him in particular, for something involved with the interrogation of prisoners of war? And that kind of goes back to this whole thing, to his work with mescaline, which was then used in interrogation and hypnosis. What wonderful things to use with prisoners of war. So you see, he may have been a junkie, and he may have been over the hill, but he still had particular knowledge and expertise that no one else did, and that made him useful. And intelligence work, you don't have to be good, you don't have to be kind, you don't even have to be smart. You have to be useful.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things I noticed when I read the book was that one of his last known suggestions was to take disaffected youth, or people disaffected with the way the status quo, and use them as suicide bombers. Doesn't that sound awfully familiar in today's news?
It does. I mean, it's one of those things that I heard somebody else mention that years ago. This probably goes like 40 years ago, before suicide bombing was the thing, and going, well, you could do their actual suggestion, and this wasn't by anybody in a position of influence, but it's just a casual suggestion by someone who I thought was kind of a kook at the time, was that terminally ill people would be perfect suicide bombers. There are people who are going to die anyway, and if you could convince them that by shortening their life by a short amount and saving them any kind of pain that would come with it, they could serve some glorious cause, you could recruit them to do it. Now, that's one extreme case, but then the idea of using those people who are disaffected and dissatisfied, and certainly that has been put to considerable use, has it not? And it still is. In fact, the suicide bomber has become one of the major weapons of the 21st century, and is likely to remain so, because it's just so simple and so elegantly and evilly simple to apply. Now, why would Crowley make that suggestion? Well, Crowley knew something about disaffection, didn't he? He knew something about alienation. He knew something about the hatred that could entail, even the kind of self-hatred that it could create as well. I mean, that's one of the things that I have to say that I got the sense of every now and then, and that came out, is that in some cases I think Crowley, it really sort of disgusted even himself.
Wasn't one of the people said his last words, I mean, there's an argument about what his last words were, but his nurse said his last words were, "Sometimes I hate myself."
Sometimes I hate myself. And if he didn't say it then, I could certainly see him saying that on other occasions. And again, that's one of those things that, not to get all soft and gushy over Aleister Crowley because he wouldn't like it, but to me, that's actually one of those things that kind of humanizes him to a degree. I'm not sure I could ever say that I've hated myself. I could say, honestly, there are times when I've been extremely disappointed in myself, and I think many other people could probably feel much the same way. But I think, that was an interesting suggestion, a kind of insight that I'm not sure, I wouldn't say that only Aleister Crowley could have had that insight to the degree to which the disappointed and the disaffected and the alienated could be turned into sort of human weapons. But he was one of the people who could see that, and as someone who could suggest it to others.
So in his own theology, is Aleister Crowley burning in Christian hell, or where do you think the final dispensation of a person like that, where his soul would go?
Well, his idea was that he could just use his will to go to a soul to some sort of place of his own. Would he want to come back and do it again? Assuming that has a choice. That really takes us off into a metaphysical question of its own. That's the big question, isn't it? That's what everybody has explanations for, and, to my mind, nobody is terribly certain about, is what do you get when this life is over? You get nothing? See, that's the hard thing. That seems to me really the thing we have, is because it's difficult to conceive of nothing. Well, when you die, it's just nothingness. Well, what's nothingness? So nothingness can't even have a name. To describe a state of being as nothingness, still somehow it's there. And so somehow we seem to have this idea that there's something, but I'll tell you from my perspective, I don't know what it is. I don't know where I would end up, and therefore I couldn't really say where Aleister Crowley would end up. Now, a standard, good, straightforward, good Christian interpretation of it is that whether or not he was a Satanist, he certainly floated too much of that, and he flaunted the advantage for salvation that was given to him. So yes, he would be burning in hell somewhere. I don't know. That's one version of things. The other is that no, he's off somewhere, and maybe he's returned to the Abbey of Cefalù as it was supposed to be, and the water's better, and nobody gets sick, and it's not dirty, and all the children are. You can construct any kind of they're a version of that, and I'm not sure. There may be people who've looked more at his particular theology and his mental thinking as to what he expected, but I don't even know if he would know. What do? You live your life and you hope for the best. And in that way, Aleister Crowley is no different than anybody else. You roll the dice and you take your chances. You make your choices and you suffer with the results of them. And he certainly did that. He became, again, as much through his own faults as anything else, a sort of martyr for his cause, as such as it was.
Now, you explore, toward the end of the book, a connection between Crowley and Rudolf Hess. And the Rudolf Hess story in its own right, that is worthy of a book, because there's a lot of questions about Rudolf Hess that his own son said that history is not correct.
Well, Rudolf Hess, and again, for anybody listening I assume a lot of people have heard him, but Rudolf Hess was a high-ranking member of the Nazi elite who for many years was a close friend, some argue one of the best friends of Adolf Hitler. And by the time of the Second World War, Rudy's and Adolf's friendship had tarnished a bit. And so in 1941, just about a month or so before Hitler was going to change the whole course of the war and invade Soviet Russia, betray his deal with Stalin and attack Russia. And Rudolf Hess, supposedly, the standard story goes, on his own initiative and, encouraged by his astrological predictions of success, because Rudy was really into anything occult. So he was either a seer or a sucker, depending on your point of view. Got into a Messerschmitt 110, flew across the North Sea, crash-landed in Scotland, and was taken prisoner. His mission, his avowed mission, was to seek out members of the British establishment who wanted to make a separate peace with Germany and to negotiate a peace between England and Germany, the two Aryan empires that would end, as he saw it, their fratricidal feud, so that Germany would have a free hand, possibly with English support, who knows, to attack Bolshevik Russia. Hess believed that this was absolutely necessary to do. And, actually, from a geopolitical standpoint, he was right. The two-front war was not a good idea. And this was also something which, keep in mind, basically saved Britain's position. Because until Hitler invades Russia, Hitler has overrun, Hitler has a deal with Stalin. He's divided Eastern Europe with him. He's conquered France, Spain, Sweden, or neutral allies. He has the whole thing. The only thing that's eluded his control is England, and that's because there's water between them. But the British on their own could never have defeated Nazi Germany. It was impossible for them. It was an unequal contest. What saved their position was Hitler going to war in the East and sending 75% of the Wehrmacht and his resources there, where they stayed for the rest of the war. Now, Hess saw the danger in that, and I don't think as the madman, the offense assumed he was crazy, so he got in a plane and went off to do a crazy thing. It's not crazy at all. Not only was his basic political thinking not crazy, but also he wasn't crazy to believe that there were people in the British establishment, even in the British government and probably in the royal family, who were desperate to make a deal. Winston Churchill was not. And Churchill saw to it that Hess was essentially incarcerated in England for the rest of the war, and then he went on to other prisons thereafter. But the British held him in very tight security. Now, the curious thing about the story of Crowley and Hess meeting is that officially nothing like that ever happened. Hess was officially held in sort of his own personal little prison at Mitchett Place. There's no official record of him being moved for any substantial time out of that. Now, there is a curious detail mentioned in the book. There's always a curious detail. Hess bitterly complained in British captivity that his captors were doping him. He apparently felt he could detect that they were dosing his food with what he termed Mexican brain poison, which is a fascinating word, and there ought to be a band named that. But Mexican brain poison, as it turns out, was his term. It was a term other people used for, guess what? Mescaline. The same drug we were talking about before. And gee, who had done all this work with mescaline and its effects on people? And who, if you were Captain Lang of Naval Intelligence handling interrogation of prisoners of war, and Hess is a prisoner of war, and if you were going to use Mexican brain poison on him, who was the master of Mexican brain poison? Aleister Crowley. Now, that again doesn't mean that any more than his advice might have been sought as to why you would need him personally, but it's one of those interesting connections. It's a thing that has a slight click to it. The story itself, though, about their supposed meeting, and we have to say supposed because it's essentially based upon the post-war, long after post-war recollections of one man, a British Nazi. That is, an Englishman who was sympathetic to the Germans, to National Socialism, a guy by the name, I think, John Gaster. And Gaster had been arrested by the British government and had been temporarily detained under Article 18B, which allowed for detention without trial or charges for the duration of the war. And what he talked about was a supposed meeting that took place at what we would now refer to as a black site, a black prison. And it was a place which was officially called 020 or O20. It's O20. Also known as Ham Common. It was an area off in the suburbs then of sort of southwest of London. I think it was a refurbished reformatory or school, but it was used as a prison, a very secure prison or holding place, an interrogation center for high-level prisoners, SS officers and others who had been taken. Only certain people were sent there. And supposedly, from the information that Gaster had, Hess was seen there, and at the same time, Crowley was seen there. And remember, this is a place where Hess is officially never supposed to have been, and it's a place where Crowley was never supposed to have been. But remember, in that period, and for some years afterwards, it was a place that was itself never supposed to have been. A prison that didn't exist. So, is it conceivable that Hess might have been taken there for some kind of special interrogation protocol? Yes, doesn't mean it was, but it could have happened. It's not unfeasible. We're not clear as to why he might have been moved elsewhere, but, for instance, he might have been moved from his regular place of incarceration to this one, which was much more secure and with different people who would never be able to compare notes with the ones of the other one. And again, even in this story, as far as I can tell, you never have Hess and Crowley in the same room. You have them at the same place. Now, true, a rather unlikely that they would be there for different reasons, but it could have been. So it's one of those things that I can't really, it can't be declared as true because there's nothing else to corroborate it. But there are enough elements in it that it can't be entirely dismissed. And my suspicion is, my hunch, let's say, my sort of gut instinct is that if this is not the absolute truth, it's something which is close to it, that includes elements in it. Because one of the things is that I think at the time that Gast or others mentioned this, the whole existence of O20 or 020 wasn't even known. Nobody even knew what Ham Common was. This was a place that was never supposed to have existed at all. So to even be aware of that place and of what went on there suggests some kind of knowledge that this wasn't just something that was quite literally conjured out of somebody's hat. So it's another one of those things that it's another avenue that could be explored. There's always the hope that somewhere you're going to run across, the idea of the proverbial chest of papers in an attic somewhere or somebody's unpublished memoir that will explain this. Here's a simple fact about history and a lot of the mysteries in it and a lot of the questions, whether it's about Aleister Crowley or anything else. We're never going to know the answer for sure. The belief that many people get in school that history consists of, that there's a big black book somewhere, like a giant grimoire, and it's full of everything that ever happened exactly as it happened, and all we have to do that and read it and understand it, that does not exist. Most of what has transpired in human history in the past and recently, we don't know. And much of what we think we know is either flat out wrong, or it's a very imperfect version of it. I mean, there's a great deal. History isn't one of those things that lends itself to absolute certainty, except in very rare occasions. And it's like the idea that history is not composed of facts. Facts are relatively few and far between. Most of history is opinion, like everything else. There are a smattering of facts, and then people express opinions about what those facts mean, which ones are relevant or otherwise. So the thing that sort of fascinates me with this topic, that fascinates me about Crowley himself and looking at his connections, his long on-again, off-again, kind of tortured connection with intelligence, the various things that he's done, the sort of part of his life is unappreciated, isn't because we may ever know all of it. I mean, that one in some ways would kind of ruin it almost. It would take the mystery out of it. But because we know enough of it that it offers us a kind of vision of the possibilities that are there, of the things that could be, and the things that might very well be. It's like, what's on the other side of life and death? Well, you'll know when you get there. It's the possibility that keeps you going. Even if you don't want to believe in heaven, it's the possibility that comes with that. Even if you don't want to believe in hellfire, it's the possibility that makes you behave. It's the same thing there. But I think it's a fascinating story. There's one other one, if I could throw in something, in terms of a kind of mystery, something that another addition to the book I would add in there, the things that have been added since. And it again goes back to sort of Crowley's alleged or often rumored connection. Here's one that people will run across. Aleister Crowley either met Adolf Hitler or had some kind of influence on Adolf Hitler. There's even a book, I've seen it, that Aleister Crowley was Adolf Hitler, okay? That he was actually a double for him, or he trained him in some way. But you'll come across these ideas of a connection between Aleister Crowley and Adolf Hitler. Here's what I think that is based on. Crowley was active in Berlin in 1930, 31, and early 32, again discussed in the book, when the Nazis are coming to power, a critical transition in German history. And he was in Berlin, and he was there, for the most part, hang out. One of the things, this is one period where we know that he actually, in Berlin, one of the things he was doing was spying on IRA activists there and funneling that information back to Scotland Yard and British intelligence. That's the one place where you can actually show he was being paid for these reports. But I don't think that's all he was doing. The British government, like any other, was very interested in what was happening in Germany, the most powerful country in Europe. And therefore, as the Nazis' electoral power grew, as the Nazi Party went from being a minor party to the biggest party in the Reichstag, and Hitler was catapulted into becoming chancellor, prime minister of the country, Crowley for most of that period has a front row seat. And again, what is he doing? He's there. He's an English expatriate, sort of discreditable occultist. No one's going to pay much attention to him, but he keeps his eyes open. He keeps his ears open. He reads the newspapers. He reads the magazines. He observes and reports. And remember, there were questions going around. Is that, what kind of occult influence is there on Hitler? Is there something else? Who would be better able to judge that than he? But here's the case that much of this idea of Crowley being connected to Hitler is a case of mistaken identity. And the mistaken identity is with another person, someone who never attained the same sort of fame, the posthumous fame as Crowley, but who was much more famous during his life, a German stage magician and clairvoyant and astrologer named Erich Jan Hannussen, Hanussen. Hannussen was a big, this was, remember, the age before television and movies had just gotten started. He was a major stage star, and he had earned a reputation as a mentalist. And then he had branched out into astrology, and by the end of the 1920s, he was one of the biggest sort of names in popular entertainment and popular culture in Berlin. He had 2 personal magazines going at the same time, one of them devoted to astrology. Hannussen decided that he was going to back the Nazi horse. And so as the elections in 30 and 30 and 31 and 32 unfolded, his publications began to first subtly and then more obviously back the rise of the Nazis. And that, of course, attracted people in the Nazi Party to take an interest in him, and he was befriended by Count von Helldorf, who was the head of the Brown Shirts, the SA organization in Berlin. Helldorf, in fact, in 1932, would later introduce Hannussen to Hitler. So, Hannussen, who was, let's say, an occultist in his own right. He dabbled in magic as well as astrology and mind reading. And he may have been a charlatan, he may not have been. But nevertheless, he gained enough fame, and through his predictions that the Nazis were going to win and his prediction that Hitler was bound to become German Chancellor, he actually gets an introduction to Adolf Hitler. They have at least 2 meetings. He does give actual advice to Hitler. So the thing that Crowley gets accused of doing, Hannussen actually does.
Interesting. And on that note, my friend, we're almost out of time. How was that for a fast 3 hours?
That was a fast 3 hours.
I can tell you that. We're going to have to do this again. Because I'm pretty sure there's a lot more to this story that we got to get into.
Oh, there's definitely more of that. And there are other stories, too.
Would you please, quickly, in 30 seconds, tell our audience where they can find all of your books?
Okay, you can find all of my books, and, Secret Agent 666, which is Aleister Crowley, British Intelligence and the Occult. You can find that on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, wherever finer books are sold in stores, and particularly online. Amazon would be the first place I would go to. My other books, if I can plug those, I mentioned Sidney Riley, Trust No One, The Secret World of Sidney Riley, More Spies. And my latest book, which my publisher would be very unhappy if I didn't mention, which is coming out, if this is June where you are, it's coming out later this month, is Wall Street and the Russian Revolution. So if any of you out there have been aware of Anthony Sutton's earlier book, Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution, I have basically taken where Anthony Sutton started, gone over that material. This is not meant to replace his book, but to greatly expand it. So, if you've ever wondered whether or not Wall Street capitalists might be willing to subsidize revolutionaries to carry out regime change with the idea of potential profit, well, read the book and find out. And I think you'll be surprised at a lot of things.
I got to cut you off there.
All right.
Thanks to my team, Lana Scott, personal assistant, Everett Thiemer, Eric Markham from The Encounter Online, Jolene Lammers, web design, Catherine James, social media, Bob Davis, the intro voice, Kim Gandy, director of business development, and Thomas McGowan in sales. You're listening to Spaced Out Radio. We'll do it again in 24 hours from now. Hope you join us. Dr. Lauren Bell, NDEs. Mr. Bumblefoot, take us home.